"I will never let you marry her," the father shouted at the top of his voice. "I don't care what you think. I love Emma and I will marry her," answered the son just as loudly. "And don't blackmail me. I won't take a penny from you." "You idiot. You want to throw it all away?" Aiden's eyes burned with rage. "Go away. I don't care what happens to you." "Do you think I can't be happy without you? Look at what you've become," Steve said angrily. "I'm ashamed to have a father like that." He turned and walked toward the door. "Puppy," Aiden's words rang like thunder throughout the house. "Get out of here, you ungrateful bitch." There was no single truth in this situation, no single truth. It was just like any other situation. Aiden was a man who was outwardly stern, rigid, and somewhat insensitive. All his accomplishments had come at too high a price, and there were a lot of them. 2 accounts with many zeros, a luxurious mansion, 2 apartments in major cities, 3 luxury cars, and a modest, but still a yacht. Such a fortune did not allow the man to remember how he had gotten all his riches. But Aiden had dreamed of the good life since he was a teenager. He was a smart boy. Perhaps some would call him cunning. So, at 17, he started looking for a gold mine. And how did he realize at the time that most likely this vein would not flow from the most honest sources? And was Aiden ready for that? No, he wasn't going to take someone's life or commit any other serious atrocities. But taking from someone something that didn't belong to him, the guy didn't mind at all. Naturally, he didn't want to be Robin Hood. He was only interested in his own life. And 6 months after his 20th birthday, the opportunity presented itself. The army was already behind him. Young Aiden learned a few things there too. And not just how to swing his arms. It was in the fall. It was raining, and everyone in the village had gone home. It was a large village, and it had recently become a township. Aiden didn't know much about such things. What mattered to him was that there were wealthy people here. When he returned from the army, he was surprised to find a whole cottage town lined up on one side of the village. He was told that it was fashionable, and now everyone who wanted to show their face had to build a huge house. The guy walked along the closed territory, and the scale of it amazed him. From time to time, expensive cars drove through the barrier. It was unusual. Back then, this way of life was just emerging. "Wow, they live." The young man scratched his head. "I wouldn't mind living like that either." And as they say, it's said and done. Only it took Aiden many years. But his first case was the most shameful. Aiden preferred not to revisit the story so he wouldn't remember it. "Aiden, what do you do?" Nick came up to him one day. "Where do you work?" "Nowhere," he sighed. "I spent a month at the mill, but the owner stopped paying me money." I've heard Nick sat down beside him. "That Shaglove is quite a beast. I wonder who will work for him now." That idiot probably didn't think about that when he didn't pay people. "It's hard here," Aiden said sadly. "I went to the cottages, trying to get a job with someone. No luck. They've got a lot of nerve." Nick was indignant. "They built their palaces on our land, and they employ city workers. Lawlessness. Here Lud Yakubovsky and her husband are lucky, and Sasha, and the villain. And what do the rest of us do? Steal. But if it were possible, someone would have done it long ago. They've got a fence, guards. I suppose they have dogs at night," Aiden wondered. "There are no dogs there. I know they were going to put some kind of cameras in there," Nick said. "I'll tell you a secret. I've been up there before," he whispered. "Oh, yeah," Aiden moved closer to him. "So what? Is there anything good there?" "It's possible there. But you understand?" "I think so. It'll be hard to do it alone, of course, but it won't be too hard for 2 of us to get something interesting." The conversation was over, and Aiden, with thoughts brewing in his head, went home. He was going to Chris's tonight. The girl was easy, and Aiden was even considering marrying her. Maybe some houses are standing empty right now, he thought as he went to bed that afternoon. The date went by in a hectic manner. The guy kept going over his plan in his head. After half an hour, he said goodbye to Chris under the pretext of a toothache and left. He had a lot of questions. Would he be able to keep his mouth shut? And 3 days later, Aiden and Nick made their first foray. They looked at all the houses. Some had lights on. Many were just under construction. But one house caught the boys' attention. It looked like someone lived there. Nick showed Aiden where the cameras were. There were only 2 of them so far. There weren't even any streetlights in the part where they were going to do their thing. There were only 2 finished houses on that street, including the one Aiden liked. "Nick, can we get into it?" Aiden asked. "When will they be back?" "My gut tells me we'll find something in there. It's dangerous, but it's worth a try," Nick said. "I suggest we watch him for a while longer." At 2:00 in the morning, they were guarding near the house, and on the 3rd night something strange happened. They were hiding near a pile of toughened bricks. The pile was so high that they could not be seen. There was a high fence around the house. The guy saw the gate swing open and an expensive car drive into the yard. It was good that they hadn't managed to sneak in yet. Some commotion was heard. The villagers held their breath and listened to what was going on, but to their amazement, 20 minutes later, the car drove sharply into the street, and all was quiet again. "What was that?" Aiden whispered. It was the owner's coming, Nick answered. Looking at him. I don't know, he shrugged. It's kind of weird, actually. The house seems to be residential, but as long as we've been watching it, no one's ever been here. Except today. Let's take a look, Aiden suggested. Nick was scared. He assumed someone was still in the house. There was no one there. Aiden insisted. Maybe they'd left something valuable there. Nick reluctantly climbed over the fence. Everything was quiet. The thieves looked through the house, but there was no one there. Aiden tugged gently on the door. It was closed. Okay, let's go. We won't find anything here, Nick whispered and headed for the fence. Aiden suddenly glanced at the foundation, walked over to it, and examined it as closely as he could. His eyes had long since gotten used to the darkness. The boy thought the footprints near one spot seemed strange. It had rained today, and the hosts had had to tramp through mud. Aiden instinctively began to fumble with his hand on the ground, but found nothing. Suddenly he lost his balance and leaned his hand on the foundation and felt something shift beneath him. Nick had already climbed over the fence and was waiting for him outside. Aiden continued to feel the stone. One of them moved easily away from the masonry. Then the other followed. The boy's temples began to pound. As if in a fever, he dismantled what would normally have been part of the foundation. Aiden saw that between the asphalt and the foundation there was a small passage into which a man would certainly not fit, but a hand could fit through. He did his best to open something iron, bolt-like. He grabbed the first thing that came to hand. A crunching sound was heard. Aiden began to rake the ground with his hands and soon found a box of some sort. With trembling hands he pulled it out, quickly filling everything back up and putting the stones back in place. Aiden grabbed his booty. "Dim, what are you doing?" Nick asked, climbing over the fence. "Nothing, I was just looking around the house, thinking about how to get in," Aiden answered, trying to hide his excitement. His voice was shaking, for he had thrown the box into the bushes a second before Nick appeared. They went home. 2 hours later, Aiden came back into the yard, grabbed his find, and rushed back like a madman. He hid in a shed where no one could see him. He lit a candle and realized at once that he was holding a safe. Guessing at the code was pointless, so the next day he decided to act differently. Aiden turned on the bolt cutter to cut off the old rebar, then moved to the shed but sawed only one side, and then bent back the wall with a crowbar. Aiden covered his mouth with his hand in amazement. "My God, that's a lot," he whispered. 3 hours later, the boy managed to free the whole bag. He stared at his find like a madman, but after a moment he was overcome with fear. "They'll be looking for me now," he trembled like an aspen leaf. "My God, what have I done? I must run away." Then he took some money and hid the rest in a very safe place. He told his parents that he was going to the city to earn money. They didn't mind. Their son didn't want to do hard work, and they were tired of feeding him, so everyone was happy. The boy rented a place in the city and got a job as a loader. He needed to stay there for a while undercover. He called his parents from time to time, but there was no news of the theft. As Aiden realized much later, the money had been stolen. It had been hidden under the foundation in a cache so no one would find it, and they wouldn't have been found if it hadn't been for his shrewdness. Some thieves couldn't report others to the police. 3 months later, with fear, Aiden went home for a couple days. He personally verified that there were no rumors of what had happened. On the street, Chris saw him. "Aiden, where'd you disappear to?" "I almost lost my mind. I went to see your parents." Chris, the boy, was confused. He didn't want anyone to know what was going on in his life. "Chris, you're a nice girl, but, I met someone else. I'm sorry." He decided to cut all ties with her. Chris covered her face with her hands and started sobbing loudly. She loved Aiden and she was going to marry him. She never thought he could betray her. "Why would you do that?" she shouted and ran towards her house. Aiden looked after her. "Then we should take everything and get out of here," he said to himself. "Otherwise I'll be caught for sure." 2 days later, Aiden left his home for good. He was starting a new life he had never dreamed of. Back in town, he was afraid to count his money for a long time, but when he did, he almost went crazy with joy. I had to hand it to him. Aiden was a pragmatic guy. He wasn't going to spend his money on entertainment or clothes. The first thing he did was buy himself a studio apartment. Then he spent a couple months thinking about where he could invest such a large sum of money. Aiden didn't want to take too many risks and chose the traditional direction, building materials. It's like bread, people are building or renovating all the time. You can't organize anything without this industry. A year later, Aiden already had his own small business. The money allowed him to develop further, and the guy started to expand. It should be understood that without education and experience, everything was given to Aiden with great difficulty. He had to learn everything from scratch. He didn't expect himself to be so industrious. Only the capital he was so lucky to have was the initial capital. But it was impossible to build a serious business without labor and effort. "You first go through what I went through." The father was angry when his son left. "You didn't have to get up at 5 in the morning to take mixes and cement in a warehouse at 6 and carry them on your back until you were blue in the face." Steve was a good kid. and Aiden understood that. The boy had grown up neither greedy nor arrogant, but he thought his father should spend his money on more than just himself. Why do I need all these charities? Aiden argued with Steve. I earned that money myself. Why should I give it to someone else? Because you have a lot more than you need, Steve replied. Wouldn't you have anything to eat if you gave a couple $100,000 a month to someone? What nonsense, protested Aiden. I'm not giving a penny to anyone. Leave me alone. I wanted to reproach his son for something, but there was nothing to reproach him for. Steve refused to work for his father. He set up what Aiden thought was a shanty town, basically an orphanage for the poor and destitute. Twice a week, Steve and his friends fed the local homeless. Steve, I don't understand you at all, Aiden told him. You work in your office, you spend time and energy on it, and then you give part of the money to these alkies. That's crazy, Aiden exclaimed. Well, first of all, we are creating a rehabilitation center for drug addicts, and this, believe me, is very serious. And second, I'm not counting your money, Steve objected. That's my beggars. Aiden gave his son a good education. Steve graduated from the institute with a red diploma. After his defense, his father gave him money to start his own business. But Aiden never expected his son to go into the homeless business. You can't look at life the way you do, Steve protested. They're people too. Yes, they have mental problems, but that doesn't make them animals. Steve, please stop doing this nonsense. I didn't pay for your training so that you could lose everything now. Aiden couldn't take it anymore and swore. Jesus, who do you think you are? Well, not you, Steve said angrily. You know, nobody's going to get all those millions when you die. And I don't want it. I'd rather spend it on a good cause, on those drunkards. Aiden looked at his son with horror. Steve, this is crazy. Dad, 3 out of 10 people in rehab quit drinking. Probably at least one person will do it for good. Do you realize what a victory that would be? So you're willing to spend $1 million to cure one drunk? Aiden didn't understand. I refused to even think about it. For almost a year, they fought a continuous war. Eventually, Aiden gave up. Steve opened a rehab center, but his father had never been there and wasn't even going to cross its threshold. But then there was a new problem. As soon as he and his son found a precarious balance, Steve announced that he was going to marry some Emma from the village. Dad, you talk like you're royalty, Steve said indignantly. You're from the village yourself. What's the problem? The problem is that your Emma is as crazy as you are. Aiden snarled. You're both running after your drug addicts and drunks like assholes. It makes me hate her already. He stopped talking, then added, I did everything so that you could find yourself a decent woman and create a normal family. And you, Aiden waved his hand, you're getting on my nerves. Steve gripped the steering wheel nervously. His father didn't want to see anything but himself and his money. It was causing his son a lot of pain. After working with difficult people for almost 5 years, Steve had developed a high level of humanity. He didn't care who was in front of him, a rich businessman, a poor alcoholic, or a deputy. In his eyes, everyone deserved a chance for a better life. Deep in his heart, Steve dreamed that one day his father would come to visit him at the center. He really wanted to show what he and his team had accomplished. He stopped the car at a scenic spot. The center was located outside of town, tucked away in the woods. Steve got out of the car and breathed in the air, filled with the smell of pines and cedars. How nice it is here, he whispered, smiling to himself. The young man opened the gate. In front of him stretched a beautiful avenue, on both sides of which roses were blooming. Their fragrance was so rich that it made his head spin. Steve never told his father about it, but before he died, his mother secretly transferred a large sum of money to his account. It was thanks to these funds that he was able to open his center. In addition, Aiden did not know that, in addition to law, his son studied psychology and received another diploma. Steve noticed a few people in the distance and headed towards them. So hey guys, he smiled broadly at his charges. How are you? What are you doing? Hi, Steve Aidenovich. A short man of about 45 ran up to him at once. His nose was once broken and his body looked too skinny. Steve looked at the man carefully. This was Vince, who had entered the center a few months ago. He was going through terrible withdrawal symptoms. Psychotherapy was helping, but it was obvious that Vince was still at war inside. You look good, don't you? The chief patted him on the shoulder. The man smiled contentedly. Steve talked to the boys for a while. They were digging potatoes that they had grown themselves. In general, those who were able worked very hard. You could tell that the vegetable garden and the patient's personal farming was feeding them. Steve cast another glance at them. The tall man with the serious face was Joe. He had a very complicated fate. They had found him in a near-death state, treated him themselves in the hospital at their own expense. Then he agreed to rehab. Joe had been living and working with them for almost a year. He had nowhere else to go, so he took over the duties of the center's head custodian. Although Steve was just over 30 years old, he had already seen a lot of things in his life. The first tragic experience in his life was when, at the age of 18, while working as a volunteer, He witnessed the death of a man from an overdose. It could be said that this incident predetermined the rest of his life. From the very beginning, his father was strongly opposed to Steve's involvement in such matters, so his son hid a lot of things from him. "Steve, hi." A girl came up to him. "You're early today." Leah's back, she looked intently into his eyes. Steve shuddered. Leah's story was not an easy one. A woman with 3 small children, she was a heavy drinker. The question of revoking her maternal rights was already on the table. Steve did his best to postpone this moment and took the woman to his center. The center treated both ordinary people and wealthy people who realized that they were unable to cope on their own. The treatment ranged from free to quite expensive, which allowed not only to maintain the center, but also to develop it. So Steve took Leah in. Several times a week, the children, who were now living with her aunt, were brought to her. For almost a month, there was a fierce struggle. Leah would leave and come back. She'd argue, demand her dose. Every time she came home, it was back to square one. Steve was helpless to do anything about it. He'd done everything he could. Leah's kids were supposed to be taken away last week, but whether it was something in her, or whether the treatments and sessions were finally taking effect, she felt she couldn't live without her children. Leah walked back to the center on her own. Steve quickly made his way toward her. He saw an emaciated woman. Her hair was tangled and she sat with her eyes downcast. "I'm going to be treated," she said quietly. "Help me. I love my children." Heavy tears fell to the floor. "Leah, I'm really glad you came." Steve hugged her. "Together we'll definitely make it through this." Another girl entered the room. She was smiling happily. Steve made a sign to her and they went out. "Emma." Hi, he hugged the girl. "I want to talk to you." "Let's go into my office," Steve said, looking at Emma. Steve met Emma by chance. She was renting an apartment next to one of the alcoholics. One day he reached a point where his kids decided to send him to a rehab center. "Emma, can you help us?" The neighbor's son rang her doorbell one evening. "We're not going to make it on our own." When the girl arrived at the center, she was amazed. In her hometown, a lot of people were drinking, and it was a serious problem. She didn't know anyone was trying to fix it. Emma didn't expect herself to ask Steve. "Don't you need employees?" "We always need people," Steve replied, "but I can't just hire the first person I see. I need someone who can be neutral towards these people. Ideally, someone who is loving and caring." Emma's eyes blurred. She remembered her drunken father beating her mother. Her childhood had been like the 9 circles of hell. "I'll try." She looked intently into Steve's eyes. "I don't know if I can love them, but I guess it will come in time. When I see that underneath all that filth there is a human being just like you and me." "Love will come on its own," Steve said quietly. Emma managed to leave her town with great difficulty. She had no education. She worked part-time as an evening cleaner and delivered mail during the day. Almost 3 years went by like that. Emma was 25. At home they kept a small household, but lately nothing was going well. She was going to go to the city, dreaming that as soon as she got a job, she would take her mother. But she absolutely refused. "Emma, I'll stay here," her mother kept repeating. "I have a pension. I have enough to live on." No matter how hard Emma tried to arrange a better life for her mother, she was against it. With great difficulty, Emma worked at the rehabilitation center for one day. All the traumas of her childhood came crashing down on her at once. The girl saw similar faces, just like her father's. "I hate it." Emma sobbed in the evening. All their lives they had lived only for themselves, and now they're being taken care of. "How many times my father beat my mother? How could a man do such a thing? No, only a monster." But somehow, by some miracle, Emma managed to hold on in the nick of time. And then one morning she woke up with a strange feeling. She felt a light inside her that seemed to be pouring out. For the first time in her life, the girl felt peace in her soul. She went to work that day a completely different person. Just as Steve had told her, love had come to her. Since then, Emma was no longer embarrassed by scolding, tantrums, or patient demands. "We've got vegetable garden work to do now," Emma said to one of the patients. There was a bad glint in his eyes. The girl knew that look all too well. It was not a human being, but an animal that didn't care about anyone around it. He was only interested in one thing, satisfying his own needs. "Fuck you," the man swore, looking at her with obvious hatred. Emma understood that the patient wanted a drink and would do anything to make it happen. "Boris," she said quietly and softly, "we're in the middle of labor hour. You want to have a good meal at lunchtime, don't you? Let's help the boys. In the kitchen we will pick gooseberries. You really liked the gooseberry pie, didn't you?" The man cursed again, but put on his slippers and reluctantly headed for the door. Emma sighed and followed him. For almost an hour she had endured the tantrums of this alcoholic with years of experience. He cursed everything around him, knocked over a bucket of berries, and began stomping on them with fury. "Are you forcing me to call a nurse?" Emma asked calmly. "Let's calm down a little." "What an idiot I was for agreeing to all these fairy tales of yours." He continued to swear profanely across the garden. "I want a drink. Get me one right now." Emma sighed. Almost all of the newcomers behaved like this. About half of them left before a week had passed, but over time, the girl had gotten used to them. She was no longer touched by the tattoos, the rude words, or the insults of the patients. Emma felt sincere sympathy for them. Perhaps it was for her sincerity that Steve had fallen in love with her. Emma could be called old-fashioned, but she didn't want to live together with her boyfriend until marriage. Steve was still living with his father. Although Aiden often fought with him, he couldn't live without his son for a day. "Emma, our registration will take place without your father." Steve took his fiancée's hand. "I'm sorry, but it's okay." She hugged him. "I love you. And that's the most important thing." "We'll get an apartment right after we register," he said, looking intently into her eyes. "We've had enough of our separate existence." "I agree," she smiled. "Steve, have you talked to Leah yet?" she asked. "I think we need to meet with the child welfare authorities again. They are very negative. If Leah quits treatment one more time, they won't give her the children." Steve was happy. He had met not only a trusted friend, but a man who shared his worldview and aspirations. With the death of his mother, Steve lost his closest friend, Aiden. In the process of becoming an entrepreneur, paid special attention to girls. Chris he forgot very quickly, so his conscience did not torment him at all. However, he was lucky again. Grace turned out to be not only modest, but also a kind woman. She put up with her stubborn husband for many years. The richer Aiden became, the more his character deteriorated. Grace often thought of leaving him. She was not deterred by his money, but she realized that without her, Aiden would be lost. No one wanted him. So after Grace suddenly became ill and died, Aiden could not marry again. Young girls for fun was one thing, but he didn't want to decide to do something serious. Steve took his mother's death very hard. He was 16 at the time, and he really needed her. At that time, Aiden couldn't give his son a father's love. He tried to teach him something, but it seemed rude and inappropriate. "You're no good," yelled the father. "You're a fool. You're a worthless boy." Perhaps it was because of the lack of parental love that Steve chose such an unusual path in life, to help others. But with Emma, he was very lucky. She seemed to have the best in her to give to Steve. "Steve, I'm going to see my mom this weekend," she said. "I'd really like her to be at our reception, but I'm not sure she'll want to come." Don't worry, we'll go to her." Then he stroked her hair gently. "Just don't tell her anything yet. Don't tell her you're pregnant. Let it be a surprise." Steve had been to Emma's mother's house only a few times, but because there was always a lot of work at the center, he couldn't get away more often. It was almost 8 o'clock when Steve brought Emma home. Both of them were pretty tired. She kissed him goodbye. "I'm happy," he said quietly. "Soon I'm going to marry the best girl in the world." Emma smiled and stroked his face. By the end of the day, they had only one wish: to sleep. Steve went back home. Aiden thought about their conversation all day. "Dad," the son walked into the kitchen. His father was eating dinner. Without another word, Steve headed for his room. "I see I'm going to have to make an appointment with you soon," Aiden said grudgingly. "You're like an important bird, all business. Even I can't get an appointment that long." "Dad, if it's business, let's talk. Otherwise, it's pointless." "Spare my nerves," Steve said. "I'm absolutely against your marrying that Emma," Aiden said menacingly. "I found the right match for you." "Well, I'll tell you the most important thing. You're about to become a grandfather." Steve looked him in the eye. "Is she pregnant?" Aiden clutched his head in horror. "Oh God, no." "Maybe you've forgotten, but I'm in my 30s, he smiled, "so I'm not a boy anymore." "God, where did that Emma come from? And why didn't you kick her out?" Dad resented her. "Because she's the best girl in the world," Steve answered, and went to his room. He didn't have the strength to argue with his father. "The best girl in the world, you say? Well, we'll see tomorrow." "Everybody can be bought," laughed Aiden. "I'll offer her so much money that she'll disappear from your life the same day." Early in the morning, Steve came to see his father. He had to go to the regional center. "Dad, I'll be back late," he said to Aiden. "And I want to warn you again. After the registration, which will be in 3 weeks, as you remember, I'll move right away. We'll look for an apartment for now, and then we'll figure it out." Aiden didn't say anything. He was so angry that he was afraid to give away the plan he had in mind. "Well, go," he thought to himself. "I'll deal with your Emma in the meantime. See what she's worth." Steve left at once on business. Emma wanted to go with him, but late that night her mother called her and said she was sick. "Emma, go see her tomorrow," Steve said at once. "Maybe she'll finally agree to move to the city." It was about 10 in the morning when Aiden, satisfied, got into his car. He had already achieved such a status that he had his own director running things. Aiden only made occasional trips out to the Enterprise. "I'll finish the race and go to Milana," he sighed dreamily, remembering his mistress. Aiden knew roughly where his son's center was. He had never been there as a matter of principle, nor did he intend to. If it hadn't been for his scheme with Emma, he certainly wouldn't have gone there. Steve's father turned toward where a sign stood. "New Life Rehabilitation Center," he read and grinned. I wouldn't expect anything else from him, Aiden chuckled, the miracle worker of new life. Idiot. The car turned down a long alley. Tall pines and cedars stood on either side. Aiden shuddered. Fresh air rushed into the car through the open window. Where to next? Aiden asked irritably when the wide road ended. He noticed a parking lot and a sign indicating that he could park there. Getting out of the car, Aiden looked around. The place really was beautiful. A wrought iron gate appeared in front of him, lined with roses everywhere. Despite his rudeness, even he gasped in surprise. The gate opened, and he found himself in an alley of roses. In fact, there were plenty of flowers everywhere. Wow, Aiden blurted out. He wanted to curse, but he held back. Nice turnaround. There was a small staff driveway on the left side, but the guests had to walk. Aiden saw the main body of the building. Everything else was drowned in greenery and flowers, and it was hard to see at a glance. The man stopped in front of a soft purple-colored building. Its architecture was reminiscent of either Roman or Greek buildings of antiquity. Aiden started up the steps, passed through a row of columns, and found himself in front of the front door. The building had huge windows, and he caught a glimpse of a large hall. Good afternoon, a smiling girl came up to him at once. I'm Grace, the counselor. I'll answer all your questions. I'd like to see your center, Aiden said suddenly. All right, come on. I'll show you around, she said hurriedly. Are you a man or a woman? Aiden didn't immediately understand what she meant and looked at the receptionist puzzled. Is your patient female or male? Grace smiled. We have 2 separate buildings for men and women. Male, Aiden said, thinking on the spot. Alcoholic, he added for emphasis. The girl showed the building and its lobby. They didn't go through the wards, of course, but they toured an empty room so that they could get an idea of how the patients lived. Then they went out into the huge courtyard. There were many sports and playgrounds, a stage, and a huge garden where several people were doing chores. 2 women were planting flowers, and next to them a tall, thin man was tending to the garden. It's beautiful, Aiden said with some surprise. You must have a smart boss, don't you? Yes, Steve is a golden man, Grace said enthusiastically. He's put so much work into this center. His love for people is amazing. I've never met anyone like him. Steve's father paused for a moment. He even felt ashamed of his behavior, but his arrogance quickly took over and he continued on toward his goal. Excuse me, I was recommended to speak to Emma, your employee. Could you introduce us? He remembered his mission. Unfortunately, Emma isn't in today, Grace replied. She can't be in until tomorrow. Is she sick? Aiden blurted out, or was she away on business? He was anxious to finish this case as soon as possible. She went to Peanuts to see her mother today, Grace said. Her mother said she wasn't feeling well. I see, he muttered under his breath. Good. I really liked your center. I think I'll bring my nephew one of these days. Thank you for the tour. Here, take our booklet. The girl handed him a booklet. Everything is here, about conditions, prices, and how to get free seats. I think you will be interested. Could you tell me Emma's last name again? Aiden asked on the way. Zhdanova, the receptionist smiled goodbye. She sat down at her desk and began to work on some documents. Aiden walked quickly down the pink alley. He wasn't going to back down. Something in him was startled. This puppy had really turned around in a big way. To launch a case like this, how is it organized? Convenience, beauty, cleanliness, Aiden thought. I certainly didn't expect this from him. I thought it would be some dilapidated house where he kept his alcoholics and homeless, but he had a real rehabilitation center. Orakov was 70 kilometers from the city. The trip for Aiden was turbulent. The always self-confident businessman had strange feelings for himself. What his son was up to was grandiose, and he couldn't deny it. But at the same time, it all seemed to him to be an affront to his own dignity. It's like he's outdone me, Aiden whispered under his breath, his hands on the steering wheel. I've worked so hard, and it's all come easy to him. Of course, Aiden despised it. He rarely remembered the story of his thievery, and how it was the only reason he'd gotten rich in the first place. He had always positioned himself as a man who had made incredible efforts to become a famous businessman. It had been a long time since Aiden had been as stressed as he was during this trip. From the intense thought activity, he almost crashed into the castle at the entrance of the village. Soon he saw an old man sitting on a bench. Father, where do the Zhanovs live? He drove up, and without getting out of the car, leaned out the window. Yes, on the last street. The old man waved his hand. They have the 10th house. There's a small shack there. You'll see it right away. The last street was one of the 3 streets in the village. Aiden drove his expensive car down a dirt road that had been trampled by people over the years. He wanted to go in to see his owners with all the honors, but something made him just open the gate. There was no dog in the yard. Looking around, Aiden noticed that everything looked shabby. His insolence took over. He started to walk around the house, and through a small window he saw a woman lying on a bed. Next to her was fiddling with what appeared to be Emma. An idea popped into Aiden's head. He walked out of the yard and got in the car. I think we'd better give the money to her mother, Aiden grinned. We'll make a deal with her, and she'll definitely get Emma to dump Steve. They're so poor, 10 million will seem like manna to her. They'll have enough money for the rest of their lives. Aiden was rubbing his hands together. He was tired of the whole thing, but he was determined to come back here tomorrow and settle the matter. That evening, father and son did not see each other. Both were exhausted, each had dinner, and went to bed. Aiden dealt with Leah's issue and other matters. He went to the regional child welfare authorities and provided all the documents that the woman was in treatment with big problems. However, Steve managed to get her a few more months. If she starts drinking again, we will immediately take the children away, he was warned. They would never go back to her again. Steve couldn't take full responsibility for Leah, but he could see that there had been some changes in her. And now he had to do his best to consolidate those changes. But the director realized that a lot of things were out of his control in this situation. Steve closed his eyes and remembered the first time he organized a food drive for the homeless and alcoholics. He'd only been 17 at the time. He'd gathered 2 girls and a couple of guys, and they'd ordered a lot of food from a regular diner. The young men drove all over the city in a rented car, which was full of people in need. Among them were both men and women of various ages. His companions couldn't stand it. They wept with pity for these downtrodden people. But, as Steve found out later, not all of them drank. Some were kicked out of their homes by their children or grandchildren. Some couldn't pay their loans. There were all kinds of stories. We'll try to help her. Steve's thoughts returned to Leah. Even though she was a heavy drinker, the children were drawn to her. They would forgive her anything just to have her around. The next day, Emma tutored Leah individually. They worked a little in the garden, had a session with a psychologist, did breathing exercises. The psychologist gave her an assignment to draw a picture for her children. The point was to convey her love on paper with bright colors. The woman set to work and burst into tears. Inside, she realized that she couldn't live without her 2 daughters and son. But alcohol, like a demon, had terrible tools in its arsenal. It could somehow disarm her. "I can do it," she whispered. "I will definitely quit drinking. I'm not going back." The doctor helped her calm down. They did some calming exercises. Steve showed up at the door. "If you want, you can help us," smiling, he said. "Joe and I will be making cottage cheese." "Okay," Leah replied, standing up. She put a handkerchief on her head and followed the principal like a shadow. Steve had already changed for work. Joe was tending the cows. Steve looked at him. Almost a year ago, Joe had been on the verge of death, but as soon as he came to his senses, he had resolutely refused alcohol. He was a withdrawn man and told little about himself. But Steve knew his terrible story. As a child, his stepfather had beaten the boy, and Joe's mother also drank. Except help. Steve smiled. "How are we doing today?" He stroked one of the cows. "Good." Joe barely smiled. "Zorka's going to calve soon." "Aiden, we should vaccinate the goats. We should call the vet." Everyone washed their hands, put on robes, grabbed brooms, and headed for the small building where cheese and other dairy products were made. Unfortunately, Steve was called, and leaving his charges behind, he headed downtown. Aiden, satisfied, was on his way to Nuts. His mood was much better today. After yesterday's visit to his son's center, he felt pinched. It was obvious that his son was ahead of him, and that hurt his father a lot. But today's experience had lifted his spirits, and he thought he was irresistible again. "After I give her the money, I'll go straight to Milan." Aiden planned his leisure time. "She already waited for me all day yesterday. Soon I'll have all my mistresses over the edge," he laughed. Suddenly, Aiden remembered Olesa. She was a good woman. Did he love her? Probably not. She had given him a son, and for that he was very grateful. But he couldn't go any further than that. Steve's father was a man of money, and he always had a spare airfield. One time Steve had a big fight with him about it. "You haven't got milk on your lips yet." Aiden yelled at his 14-year-old son. "You're too young to tell me how to live my life." "You traitor." The boy waved his fists at him. "I can protect my mom. I hate you. You're not worthy of her." Aiden didn't even notice that he had reached the village. Time flew by very quickly. "Well, here they are. The ruins," he smiled. "Now we'll make a show. Oh, how lucky they are that this fool has such a father. They'll make good money." Aiden walked unceremoniously into the yard, and then into the house. Footsteps were heard in the hallway, and a woman came out at the creak of the door. "Who were you here to see?" the landlady asked him. She could hardly stand on her feet, for her illness had not yet receded. Aiden stared at her face, and after a few seconds something clicked in his head. "Chris," he said hesitantly. The guest stared at her, not realizing what was happening. The woman covered her mouth with her hand, guessing as well. They were silent for several minutes. "Aiden," at last the mistress spoke. Her legs gave out. The man picked her up just in time. Aiden carried Chris on shaky legs to her room and put her on the bed. The woman was in shock. "So Emma is your daughter?" he asked quietly. "Chris? Me? Jesus!" Aiden covered his face with his hands. "You know Emma?" Chris was even more amazed. "Aiden, what's going on? Explain it to me." "Yes," he looked at her. "My son is going to marry her. I came here too. Steve is your son, she interrupted him. But he has a different last name. Chris couldn't get over it. He'd taken his mother's last name to spite me when he was 18. She's dead, Aiden said quietly. The hostess and the guests looked at each other, and some strange alchemy was taking place in their hearts. Chris, thank you for your daughter, Aiden said suddenly. I'm glad Steve chose Emma. He jumped up abruptly and quickly ran out of the house. Tears were streaming from his eyes. In an instant, everything came over him. He drove all the way home, tears welling up in his eyes as he nervously pounded his fist on the steering wheel, berating himself. On nothing, he muttered. If it weren't for the money I stole. He didn't know what was happening to him, but it was as if a dam had burst inside him, and everything he'd been holding back for years began to come out. I'm disgusted with myself, Aiden said loudly. My son is a real man compared to me, and I'm nothing. I've never had enough. And what have I accomplished? Money has turned me into a freak. I hate it. That evening, Steve knocked on his father's door. Aiden came out to see him in a low mood. Steve looked at him with a puzzled expression. Dad, are you sick? He asked with concern. You're all pale and swollen. Steve, I want to talk to you. Aiden went into the living room. Sit down for a minute. The son looked at his father carefully. Despite his fatigue, he was ready to listen to him. Steve, the father hesitated for a moment. I'll be at your check-in. I'm sorry. For what? Steve couldn't understand. Dad, thanks. He didn't bother digging into Aiden's feelings. I'm very happy, and Emma will be happy too. Son, I'd like to ask you a favor. Aiden paused. I would like Emma's mother to attend your party. I'd really like that too, Steve sighed. Okay, I'll talk to her again. Maybe she'll agree. But the surprises in Steve's life didn't end there. It had been almost a week. He was tinkering in his office. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Aiden asked to come in. Dad, Steve froze like a paralyzed man. What are you doing here? I didn't expect to see you here. I didn't expect to be here myself, Aiden said quietly. So I thought I'd see what my son was up to. Come on, I'll show you, Steve jumped up excitedly. We've got a lot of interesting things here. They walked through the buildings, looked into some of the wards. Some of the patients were in therapy. Individual and group sessions were in progress. Some were minding their own business. Joe was professionally digging a shovel into the ground, and from one of his movements all the potatoes were on the surface. Leah was gathering them into a bucket. The woman stood up to straighten her tired back. The wind ruffled her hair. She caught a glimpse of the man, and her tanned face seemed to glow. She had never seen Joe smile, but now there was a twinkle in his blue eyes. Joe, Leah, Steve waved his hand. He and her father walked over to them. Is your harvest good? Aiden said instead of greeting. The potatoes are huge. Joe's the agronomist and the shepherd. Steve smiled. He knows how to do everything. Yes, the guest extended his hand. Aiden, Steve's father, your director. So, Joe, how do you feel about fishing? Aiden asked defiantly. Good, Joe shrugged. I used to be a good fisherman, but I haven't held a rod in 5 years. I'll fix that. Aiden smiled. Steve, you let Joe go fishing with me. But if you don't offer him anything alcoholic, Steve said coldly. We're strict about that. Steve, you don't have to worry. I don't want to. Joe glanced at Leah. I'm not going back there. And then it's a deal. Aiden held out his hand to Joe. I'll pick you up tomorrow. Steve looked at his father and couldn't understand what was happening to him. He'd never seen him like this before. Dad, are you all right? He asked as they drove back to the office. Steve, as much as it hurts my ego, I'm willing to admit that you were right. Aiden sighed. I'm tired of living for myself. How long do I have left? 5, 10, 15 years? I want to spend the rest of my life in joy. I'm tired. I don't want money or fame. I never expected to hear you say that. Steve smiled. If someone had told me that a month ago, I wouldn't have believed it. But life doesn't stand still. Seriously, said his father. If even Joe can change, why can't I? What am I? Some kind of bread? Steve looked at his watch. The class was about to end and Emma should be coming out to join them. The son kept watching his father. There had been such a dramatic change in him that he wondered if everything would be back to normal tomorrow. I'm proud to have a father like that, Steve said as he approached him. Dad, you're the best. I love you. Aiden looked him in the eye. His chin quivered and tears came to his eyes. I'm proud of you too, son. Aiden hugged Steve. I'm so glad right now that you've chosen your path in life. I wish I could help them all, Steve sighed, but you have to be realistic. If we save even one, then all our efforts will be worth it. The first year I was going crazy. They'd come out of the center, and then I'd find out that almost every one of them was back to their old selves. I was running door to door, begging them to come back to the center. But now I'm satisfied that I can help at least 2 or 3 of them. Aiden was very surprised that very rich people were rehabilitated at the center. Yes, unfortunately, corrupts people. You can do anything with it. Then one day you realize that you've fallen into something and you can't get out, Steve said sadly. It's much harder for wealthy people to come to us. They think it's beneath their dignity. There was a knock on the door, and it opened. Emma entered the room. She looked at the groom in surprise. Kadosha, let me introduce my father. Steve smiled at the girl, although Dad wanted to stay in the shadows until our registration, but he came to us today. It's my pleasure, Emma glowed. Thank you for raising such a son. To be honest, I didn't do much with him, Aiden said sadly. My wife raised him. I only demanded that Steve obey me. Thank God he didn't listen to me. Aiden returned home a completely different person. He couldn't exactly describe in words how he felt, but he loved this new state. Milan, Hio called his mistress. I'm sorry, but it's over between us. I'm getting married. Aiden did not even listen to her objections and immediately disconnected the phone. For the first time in his life, the lover wasn't afraid to be alone. To hell with all these mistresses, he thought. I no longer want. I will find a decent woman and get married. I don't like climbing into other people's beds. Aiden felt like a 20-year-old boy, humming something to himself. As he sorted through his fishing equipment, he prepared for tomorrow's fishing trip. I'll take everything, the boat, 3 spinning rods, and bait. He was going through boxes of floats and lures. Suddenly, an unexpected thought came into his head and he froze. Chris has always loved me. In the evening, Aiden had dinner with his son. He really wanted to ask him about Emma's mother. Steve, tell me about my future relative, he smiled. You said Emma only has a mother. Oh, Dad, that's a very sad story, Steve sighed. Aunt Chris has been through hell. I understand how big her wounds are. I've wanted her to move to the city many times, talked her into it, but it's like she's stuck in her past. She was in love with a guy when she was younger, Steve continued. Emma said Chris was crazy about him, but he dumped her for some city girl. After that, she took a lot of pills and was barely rescued. For almost 7 years, she waited for her lover to return. But alas, it didn't happen. Her father wanted to marry her off. She was already 29 years old then, so he found her some Vladimir. It was a long way from home. Vladimir had an old mother. While she was alive, everything was tolerable. He didn't drink so much. But after her death, he went off the chain. He began to drink ungodly and beat his wife. Emma's mother was always bruised, twice in the hospital, with concussion and broken ribs. Chris asked to go home to her father, but he wouldn't take her in. He said that she had a husband now, so let him provide for her. Uncle Feed was always cruel, Aiden blurted out. Inhuman. Dad, you knew her. Steve looked at him in amazement. Steve froze with shock. Steve, I'm the one who dumped Chris. Aiden jumped up from the table. I knew her father personally. He was a horrible man. The son was silent. Everything was jumbled up in his head. His life had taken a new turn, too. That evening, they parted early. Each was going through his own pain and thinking about how to live with that truth. At 5:00, Aiden drove downtown to see his son. Steve was still asleep. Joe was waiting for him with a homemade fishing rod. Joe, but we're not going to get very far with these weapons, Aiden laughed. Well, sit down. I got some spinning rods for you. Try it out. Which one will suit you? The man gathered his things and got into the expensive car. He'd never driven one of these in his life. Why are you so out of touch? Aiden said, making himself comfortable. We're going to a very good place. We'll have a fish day at the center today. The driver glanced occasionally at the passenger. He sat with a serious face on which there was always a shadow of sadness and sorrow. It took them about an hour to get to the right place. Aiden's car was approached by a man, and he paid him. Well, Joe, welcome to fishing heaven. Aiden stretched himself contentedly. I promise you'll love it. The fishing was really good. The bite had been excellent since morning. Aiden watched Joe carefully as he pulled out one fish after another on his old fishing rod. Joe, you're crazy, he scratched his head. Are they just circling around you? He laughed and then closed his mouth. Well done, you're a real fisherman. Joe blushed with embarrassment. In fact, it was only during the last year that he had been at the center that he had been treated well and spoken kind words. The man wasn't used to that and had a hard time adapting to being treated well. Joe had worked at the dump for many years. The money paid little, only enough for a bottle and food. He lived there, too. It was about 11:00. The men, satisfied, were checking their baits. They caught a lot of fish. Mostly, of course, Joe was fishing, but Aiden had caught something too. Giant? Aiden exclaimed. Why don't we call it a day? My legs are hurting already, he asked Joe. All right, Joe replied calmly. Tonight we'll have fish on heat with boiled potatoes. It'll be delicious. I'd eat some too, Aiden stroked his stomach. Let's go. Then, it'll be a couple hours before we get it all cleaned up. Steve had called his father several times. He was worried about Joe. Aiden understood that. Yeah, Joe's a hard worker, he laughed into the phone. He's a good man, reliable. When they pulled into the center, Leah came running out to them. She was on a break, her eyes downcast. and began to help pick up the fish. So many, she wondered. Joe snatched the bucket from her hands and carried it into the kitchen himself. 20 minutes later, the three of them were sitting there cleaning the fish. Aiden was very pleased. "All right, young people," he got up from his chair, "you'll have to forgive me, but I'm tired." He stretched his back and smiled. "I'm going to get some rest." The man and the woman continued their occupation, glancing at each other from time to time. Suddenly, Steve walked in. He smiled happily. "Leah," he walked up to her. "How would you like me to bring your children over tonight?" Just for a little while, he looked earnestly into her eyes. The woman jumped up and rushed to him, bursting into loud tears. Steve stroked her head. "Thank you," she whispered. "Steve, thank you for everything." She couldn't calm down. "Leah, it's up to you." He wiped away her tears. "I have no doubt you'll be fine." "Okay, I have to run," Steve added. "Daddy will rest and help you in the kitchen. Vasya won't be able to handle such a catch alone." He glanced at the cook. Steve left. Leah stood for a while, coming to her senses. The more she immersed herself in the treatment, the more she felt pain. She was ashamed in front of the kids and in front of herself. But she decided to go all the way this time. Joe came up to her and suddenly took her hand. "You're going to make it. Do you want me to help you?" Yes, she nodded and wiped her eyes. "Joe, thank you. I really need this." "I really want it," she whispered and buried her face in his chest. 2 hours later, Aiden was standing at the stove. He had stopped being surprised at how often he was surprised. He felt light at heart, and as he turned the fish, he hummed softly to himself. "My God, what a divine aroma." He closed his eyes in pleasure. "Joe, let's have a bite each, or I'm going to go crazy with the smell." Leah left for class, and Vasily went out to the vegetable garden to get tomatoes. The two men continued frying the fish. Aiden took a bite and rolled his eyes in bliss. Joe immediately slipped him some boiled potatoes. "I've never eaten anything so good," Aiden tried to say with his mouth full. "Joe, your fish is special." He laughed and closed his eyes in pleasure. He loved being in this new company. That evening, Steve returned home with his father. He couldn't be happy about the changes that had happened to Aiden. "Dad, thank you. For me, and for Emma, and for Joe," Steve said earnestly. "All these years we've missed you as you are now." "I'll tell you, son, I've missed being like this myself," smiled Aiden. "I like this life." "What about your business?" Steve wondered. "Do you want to sell it?" Maybe, Aiden answered and sighed. "None of this is mine." "Do you know how much joy fishing with Joe? That lost man brought me," he continued. "Joe's been through a lot. He's coming up from the bottom. Of course, you can't help but hit all that silt. It creates poor visibility, and it feels like you don't know where to go. But only the strong can overcome it. Now I know what you mean, even when you say that saving one life is a great thing." "We are doing a great thing," he repeated. 2 days passed, and Aiden sat hesitantly in his car. He knew the route, but his mind was racing. Will she trust me again? After all, I already betrayed her once the car stopped outside an old house. Aiden sat in silence for a while, then got out. This time he knocked on the wicket. A few minutes later, the landlady appeared on the porch. She looked at him hesitantly. "Chris, can we talk?" he asked. "I won't be long." A drop of sweat trickled down his face from the exertion. "Hello, Aiden, come in," she replied as she opened a gate and was the first to enter the house. Chris was also very worried. She kept rubbing her handkerchief. "Chris, I admit I'm guilty," Aiden said with difficulty. "But if you can, please forgive me. Come to my daughter's wedding." The woman looked at him carefully. She was silent. So many years she had spent in fear. Her husband had died 5 years ago, but she still couldn't recover from the abuse he had inflicted on her. In the evening, they decided to have dinner at the center. Steve had asked for tables to be set up in the Great Hall. Naturally, alcohol was out of the question. Almost all the residents of the center were present for the celebration. Aiden looked at his son and felt how happy they both were. In fact, they were the heart of this place. And that heart was so big that it was enough for everyone. The man cast a glance at Chris. She was sitting modestly in a blue dress. Chris had taken off her shawl, and she looked much younger without it. "She's still as beautiful as ever," ran through his mind. How far we've come. It was a hard road to meet her again. "I think I love her." Chris noticed his gaze and lowered her eyes in embarrassment. Aiden smiled. "I need her," he whispered. "I don't want any more young girls. She's my woman." 2 months later, Aiden sold his business. He had changed so drastically that he no longer saw himself in business. Steve and Emma were constantly busy at work. They were living in a rented apartment for the time being. They physically didn't have time to buy a place to live. The mother had moved in with her daughter as well. Chris was doing housework, cleaning. When the bell rang, she flinched in surprise. The children were in the center. The woman looked through the peephole and turned pale. "Aiden," she said, surprised to see the matchmaker carrying a huge bouquet of red roses. "Come on in." "Hi," Chrissy smiled, but there was a look of excitement on his face. The hostess put the kettle on and sat down modestly on a chair. The guest kept his eyes on her. "Chris, let's try again," he said. I promise that this time I won't run away from you." The woman was silent, tears streaming down her cheeks. She took off her handkerchief and covered her face with her hands. "God, I've waited so many years for this," Chris said. "Aiden, this was my most cherished dream." After the registration, Aiden and his new wife moved to a small, modest house, which he bought for her and Chris. The young one stayed in his old house, and since they lived on the next street over, you could say they all lived close by. Steve and Emma had a son. The grandparents were very happy. Emma continued to work at the center, and they helped her with the baby all the time. Aiden also, you could say, worked at the center. He ran a few programs after he went through special training. He was really enjoying his new job. "I never thought I'd be doing this," he laughed, "but I would never trade this job for my old factory." A year later, another important event took place. It might have seemed like nothing to some, but not to our heroes. Steve opened the door, and the children rushed screaming to their mother. Leah had changed a lot. Her face no longer showed signs of alcohol addiction. Joe was standing next to her as well. Both were glowing with health and happiness. "Shall we go?" Aiden shouted. "Joe, you go with Leah and the kids in yours. I'll take Steve and Emma." The two cars, decorated with ribbons, headed toward the registry office. Emma cried with happiness the whole way. With incredible efforts, they managed to break Leah out of the clutches of a terrible addiction. The woman showed a steely will, not giving up for a single day. Leah stood in a simple pink dress with a few roses pinned to her hair. The children listened breathlessly to the registry clerk. Everyone began to clap, and Joe leaned over to his wife and kissed her. Aiden brought his hand to his eyes and brushed away a tear. As a wedding gift, he had bought some land near the center at his own expense and built a small house for the newlyweds. Now Leah and Joe, who also worked at the center, could combine their favorite business with their family. What an unpredictable life, Aiden reflected. I thought I'd lost my son. Not only did I find him, but I found a wife and a true friend. He glanced at Joe. It's a good thing it happened this way, Aiden thought. Finally, karma for the money I once stole has left me alone. In the evening, the loud sounds of Indian melodrama could be heard in the house. The cheerful music sounded like mockery. Julia's daughter-in-law, the lady of the house, had been doing chores late into the night. Now she was tearfully scrubbing the floors of the spacious four-room apartment, while Mendelssohn's March played in her head and the words came to mind: Registrar. Do you, Linda, agree to be Christopher's wife? Why had she agreed? Gave in to her fiancé's entreaties to live with her mother. She put on her wedding ring and was transported into a dark world of hopelessness. Christopher, indulging his mother in everything, did not believe his wife. There was no miracle. Her husband was not going to support and protect her in a difficult moment. And the mother-in-law was dodgy, weaving intrigues, loaded unnecessary work, conspired against the daughter-in-law. It was not the difficulties of family life that frightened Linda, but Christopher's misunderstanding, the unfairness of life. Today she was worried that she had scrubbed the floors for the second time only because her mother-in-law did not believe her, because she had already cleaned the whole house in the morning. In the evening, Christopher supported his mother, not understanding why his wife was stubbornly unable to do simple housework. When she finished cleaning, Linda quietly snuck into the bathroom and closed herself in. Here she could give free rein to her feelings, rest from the family burden. The well-appointed apartment, unlike her country house, was a joy to bathe in at any time, without heating the stove. It was a small consolation to Linda. She missed the peacefulness of the village, her yard, the warmth of communication with the villagers. She drew water with a snow-white cap of foam and sank into the tub with pleasure. She remembered again the carefree moments of her unmarried life, and then her acquaintance with Christopher and her sudden wedding. Linda had fallen in love with the kind guy on the motorcycle. At first sight, Christopher then came to his grandmother in the village. One day, driving through the village, he saw a lovely girl with a black braid down to her waist, a gentle look, and a basket in her hands. It was a marvelous vision, as if a forest nymph had come out of the pages of books. She was walking with the little girl's basket, which had been composed to her by a kind-hearted grandmother for a letter from her son. Christopher stopped and asked her to treat him to a strange berry he had never seen before. Thus began a relationship. The guy surrounded his beloved with care and invited her to live in his luxurious four-room apartment. Linda immediately did not like Julia Urban, spoiled woman who did not want a soul in her son. She disapproved of her son's girlfriend and called her cunning. And here was a gift from Christopher, a village shepherdess, an orphan of Kazan, without a family and tribe. Linda buried her parents long ago and lived poorly, a lonely postmistress. And at her husband's insistence, she quit her job and moved to the city. Why? What for? There was a persistent knock at the door. Julia's irritated voice brought her out of her reverie. Are you at it again? How many times have I told you not to lock the door? How many times have I told you not to lock the doors? You haven't brought a penny into the house yourself, and yet there you are, a lady bathing every day. Open the door at once. I have to go to the bathroom. I have a scheduled beauty treatment. Mom, what's wrong? Christopher came running to the door. Your wife wouldn't clean my room, so I had to do it myself. I have a bad back. The medicine's in the bathroom. I've been here for an hour and she won't do it. And she was rude to me. Talk to your wife, you're doing the same old thing. You're slandering me, Mom. Linda opened the door in astonishment, hastily climbing out of the bathroom. It's been 15 minutes, and I've mopped the floors in every room, she objected. Look at you, you cheeky girl. Get out of my sight. Julia shoved her sister-in-law violently in the side, causing her to fall. Linda, stop quarreling with your mother, Christopher said coldly. Show some respect. Please, if it's not too much trouble for your highness. He turned around and walked away. Angrily stupid. Day after day, her mother-in-law nagged, making up tall tales, complaining about her deteriorating health because of such an ungrateful daughter-in-law. Linda baked pies, cooked French and Italian dishes, studied new recipes, watched blogs on homemaking. Nothing worked. The main goal of the mother-in-law was to get rid of her daughter-in-law by any means necessary, to kick her out for no reason, because such a girl is out of status. Christopher was a famous lawyer, and his late husband was a prosecutor. They still had long-standing ties. They had important visitors, very influential people in the city. Julia was shy of Linda, who didn't know how to handle cutlery. Linda dressed simply gray, refused to go to beauty salons. Her unwillingness to get her hair and nails done made Julia mad at guests. Mother-in-law politely, but coldly pulled her daughter-in-law, told her not to show her face to anyone. A hard, tedious, joyless year passed. Linda got a job as a saleswoman in a store near the house. Her husband stopped giving her money at her mother's instigation. At work, her daughter-in-law was relieved from the endless reproaches. But at home, it got worse. Now, Julia reproached her daughter-in-law for not doing her chores. My darling, you're always at work, and your husband must be fed and cared for. I'll talk to my son, so he won't let you slack off from housework. Mom, I have time for everything, Linda objected. I cook in advance, everything's in order. I clean up morning and night. What's this new fashion of working? Quit working. I'm ashamed you're working as a saleswoman with a husband like that. It's a disgrace. Christopher doesn't even leave me money for my household because of you. And I still have a house in the country to keep, bills to pay. Orphan of Kazan, you don't need to spend our money. Christopher buys everything for the house. The arguments upset Linda. Later, her mother-in-law reprimanded her son for how rudely his wife talks to her, does not listen to her advice. Linda was deeply hurt by Julia's words that she was ashamed of her uneducated daughter-in-law. It was painful to remember why Linda never enrolled in the institute. Hope was the pride of her parents. She graduated from high school with honors, planned to enter the medical academy. But a month after graduation, her parents were in an accident, returning from the city. My father died in the hospital without regaining consciousness. Mom slipped into a coma. For 6 months, Linda traveled to all the hospitals, begging in the hope of saving her mother, bribed, begged for an operation. But the situation was hopeless. No one could help. Mom never woke up again. Having buried her mother, Linda was left an orphan. To get by, she worked part-time in a store, then found a job at the post office. The road to the academy was closed. There was nothing to pay for her studies. Linda spent all the money she had saved on hospitalization and funeral expenses. The hard fate did not bother her mother-in-law. She could not allow a homeless girl from the village to run her house. Julia found a new way to get rid of her daughter-in-law. Christopher, she said to her son, we need an heir. Why can't your wife get pregnant? Mom, it's been so little time. Perhaps it's too soon to talk about children. My dear, a child will help reconcile us all. My dear. It's such a blessing. I'd be so happy if you'd give me a grandchild." The cunning mother-in-law cried and hugged her son. "All right, I'll talk to Linda. But I agree, it's up to me." In the evening, Christopher pleased his wife with his desire to have children. He didn't say anything about his mother's request. Julia went to extreme measures, which became known later. Linda rejoiced at the possibility of becoming a mom. A child could really soften her husband, and her life would be happier. She had been living with the dream of a child since her wedding, but she had been unable to get pregnant. Another 6 months passed. Linda cried as she held the pregnancy test in her hands. Disappointment again. Fear settled in her soul. Her mother-in-law would scream, her husband would support her mother and angrily slam the door. For the second month, he began to appear less often at home, stayed late at work, met with friends. Julia was satisfied she had broken up the young people after all. There was one last step to take. One day, Linda came into the room and saw Christopher. He was sitting there with his face twisted with anger. When he saw his wife, he swung and hit her in the face. "Ungrateful bitch," he shouted and threw a packet of pills at her. "How dare you lie to me and Mom? Explain to me what these are." "These are pills, but this is the first time I've seen them." Linda read the instructions with shaking hands. They were birth control pills. The weight of the last few months of endless humiliation, frustration, and disappointment fell on her in an instant. She collapsed without feeling, no longer wanting to live and breathe in this cruel, absurd world. Christopher, although angry at his wife, felt guilty, but could not bring her to her senses and called an ambulance. Julia snickered at the pills and indifferently sent her daughter-in-law to the hospital. "Mom, why is she doing this to me?" Christopher complained bitterly to his mother. I told you, I told you. I told you, I told you, I told you, I told you. Don't you dare forgive her. This is no way to get a divorce, Mother. I promised her she'd be happy, but she lied to me too. I'll go to work early in the morning, and then I'll visit my wife and talk to her calmly." 3 days later, Linda was discharged. She took the bus home. Christopher didn't meet her. He was at work. A suitcase and a note from her husband about the divorce were waiting for her at home. Her mother-in-law was triumphant. She threw Linda out without letting her wait for her husband. She was just a village idiot, and she still is. You shouldn't have messed with all of us. Get out. I can't see you, you snake. You wanted to separate me from my son. It won't happen. Out, out, I said, immediately. So that you don't breathe. The mother-in-law shouted after her, unwilling to stop her anger and triumph at the same time. In the evening, Christopher found out that his wife had left. "Mom, why didn't Linda wait for me? How dare she leave me? Why didn't she say anything?" "Calm down, son. It was her decision." Julia was careful not to mention the note she'd written, copying her son's handwriting. But how? She didn't even leave a note. "You two haven't been getting along for a long time. This woman isn't right for you. What will that hillbilly have for you? Without children, there's no family. It's an omen that if she did, she'd give birth to an inbred simple thing that's nothing to breed. Look for a wife of status by getting rid of your daughter-in-law." Julia felt over the moon she had gotten her way on the plan. For a year, she drank Linda a decoction of wormwood, convincing her that this tea is good for women's health, hoping to bring a young, healthy girl to infertility. Then she slipped her birth control pills. Christopher was upset. He figured Linda hadn't forgiven him for the slap. With longing in his heart, he walked across the room where he smelled her perfume. Sitting down on the bed, he went through the pills. A suspicion crept into his soul. The packages were intact, all the pills in place. Perhaps Linda hadn't taken them. He remembered hundreds of moments when his wife had cried and complained about her mother and he hadn't believed her. The bitter discovery struck his heart with the pain of no return, of loss. He himself, with his own hands, had destroyed love. There is no forgiveness, but Linda is his beloved, without whom it is so lonely and dreary. He will rent an apartment for her, and tomorrow he will go to the village to beg for forgiveness. An Indian song was playing loudly in the next room. Julia, with a blissful smile, was triumphant. She was more at ease when others were suffering, but her carefree life did not last long. One day she would receive a letter that would turn her whole life upside down, change her character, teach her to be compassionate, empathize, do good. But now she was far from even a moment's regret for her dastardly deed. Christopher didn't get out to his wife's home village right away. He had to see the client through to the end. A week later, he took a vacation and went to Linda. As 2 years ago, he decided to ride a motorcycle to return former feelings. He did not inform his mother about his departure. He was offended by her, tried to avoid talking. He even looked anxiously at his sad son, hoping that time would heal him. Julia was already looking for a worthy match for him, obedient society girl, which will distract from sad thoughts. More than once she tried to talk about divorce, but the son waved away, avoiding an answer. Christopher settled all his affairs, packed his backpack secretly from his mother and left the house. It was a clear spring day, bright. Gladly he set off on his long-awaited journey. Soon he would meet his beloved, whom he missed incredibly. It seemed to him that just today their family would open a new page of life. They would be happy, for he loved Linda so much. The road was covered with frost from the morning. In Siberia, even in May, there were frosts. Prudently, Christopher wore a balaclava and helmet, but the summer tires could fail. But that didn't stop his desire to impress Linda, to revive pleasant memories. The voice of reason was silent as Christopher accelerated, feeling a rush of energy, freedom, and lightness of mind. It was a 2-hour non-stop ride to the village. The road was a country road, not a soul around. After an hour and a half, Christopher carelessly jumped into the oncoming lane. At that time, a tractor appeared from behind the corner. It was too late to stop. He jerked the wheel to the left. The bike rammed into bushes and hit a tree. The brakes didn't work. The wheels skidded. Christopher was thrown from the saddle and rolled down the side of the road. He was unlucky to have a savior. The driver of the tractor was Max, an ex-con who didn't want to be investigated again. He slowed down, hoping to help the motorcyclist. But Christopher showed no signs of life. So Max took his things, got back into the tractor and drove off, leaving the unfortunate man to die. He didn't say anything about the accident, didn't even feel remorse. It was an accident, it was not the tractor driver's fault, and humanity, unfortunately, is inherent in few people. On the same day, Julia's mother missed her son. She found out that he had taken a week's vacation, but he wasn't answering his phone. What a stubborn man, went to his redneck. Did I alarm him or what? Julia thought. She knew where Linda lived before her marriage, but she was not going to go to her place. She decided to wait a week and see. Julia called her mother Peggy in the village to ask if her grandson had shown up. No, he hadn't. Her son's cell phone went dead. A week later, he still hadn't returned. She decided to go to the village herself. She reached Peggy's mother, whom she rarely saw or spoke to. The news was shocking. It had been a year since Christopher had visited his grandmother, whose name was Madeline. He had not come to the village a week ago, nor yesterday, nor the day before. Linda, the letter carrier, do you know anything? Julia asked her mother. It's your sister-in-law, my dear. Are you out of your mind? Peggy was silent, shaking her head. Something flashed in her eyes. She hasn't been in the village for years. Didn't she come to live with you? She and Christopher have been divorced for 2 weeks. Where else would she go but to the village? She's been away. We're almost next door, 2 houses down. Julia, you're not making a mess, are you? I know you. I know you. Where did the kids go? They ran away from you, didn't they? They did the right thing. I raised a viper, not a daughter. You don't show your face around here, you don't help your mother. If it wasn't for Christopher, I'd be all alone. Mom, you never understood me, and I couldn't stand this village. What good is it? I'm sorry, but I was raising my son. It was hard. He's back on his feet. He hasn't forgotten anyone. That's my son. I raised him that way. So you survived, Linda? I was a redneck myself, remember? You got a temper, Julia. I'm ashamed I raised a daughter like that. Peggy told me what happened. Why did the children run away from you? My son must have gone to Linda's. His motorcycle's not in the garage. Where did it go? I don't know. I'm so sorry. Julia couldn't hold back any longer. She clasped her hands together and wailed. Son, where are you, my darling? It's all my own fault. Let's go together, Peggy. Maybe they're lurking out there living. I'll give you the address. It's no use. I don't go. You go on your own and don't come back to my place alone, it'll be safer. You go, I'll call you if the kids turn up. Julia went to the address, but no one was home. She knocked at neighbors' houses. When all around the neighborhood still there was neither Linda nor her husband for a year. No one came, no one knocked. Julia, by old habit, went to collect information in the village and the store, at the post office, at the club. But it was as if Linda had vanished into thin air. With a heavy heart, she returned to the city. The trail had been broken. Her friends and acquaintances didn't know where her son was. He never showed up for work, never signed his resignation papers. Christopher disappeared without a trace. The last desperate step, a report to the police about the disappearance. For another year, Julia pounded the thresholds of government agencies, visited her mother in the village. There was no sign of her son. Later, remorse overwhelmed Julia. Nothing could dull the pain of loss. It was impossible to believe in her son's death. So she lived lonely, remembering the moments when they were together, though not always friendly. As long as he lived with that hillbilly, as long as he was near. The house was hopelessly silent now. Julia cried at the window all day long with an absent look, but she believed that her son would return. The story didn't end there. Christopher survived. He was saved by a family of witch doctors from the village of Red, which was in the neighborhood of his native village. It was an abandoned village with a few houses, where only the old residents remained to live. They traveled to their native village for everything they needed: groceries, things, small household items. On that fateful day, the daughter of the old witch doctor Luba went to the store through the village. First she saw a mangled motorcycle, and a little farther away Christopher unconscious. What grief! He must have crashed. What a handsome man he was. She sighed and shook her head. The girl's name was Roberta. She was trained in first aid, and often helped her mother treat people. Roberta checked and realized that the young man was alive, but it was not customary for the old-timers to call an ambulance. They lived in the same family, in case of trouble helped each other themselves. So Roberta ran for help. Christopher was taken to Luba's house. Things were bad. The victim hadn't regained consciousness for a week. They searched around the motorcycle, but they didn't find any documents, phone, or belongings. They were taken by a resourceful tractor driver so that there would be no trace of them at all. The stuff was just for his own use. He burned all the papers, even his passport. There was a man and he's gone, missing. The stranger woke up on the 8th day. Next to him sat a black-eyed beauty with a thick braid. When she saw that the patient opened his eyes, she jumped up and cried out, "Mommy, he's awake. Come here." A young but stately woman came in, bent over him, held his hand. "My dear, how will you live now? Where did you come from? What's your name?" But Christopher was so weak he couldn't speak. He shook his head, trying to say something, but he couldn't get a word out. "Roberta, go and get him some broth and tea." "I guess he can't talk. Then maybe he'll write from where?" The man was horrified to realize that he didn't remember his own name. Moreover, he didn't know who he used to be or who he even was. He hammered desperately, trying to get up, fell silent and lost consciousness again. He was later brought out. That's right, resiliently. The guys brought his motorcycle back, put it back together. They wanted to use it to identify the man, but somehow they forgot. It's no use, they thought. After all, the village had hardly developed. A good man, we need him. Christopher didn't remember his former life. It was his fate. Scarlett nursed Christopher back to health. She had fallen madly in love with him. He, too, was enchanted by this extraordinary, caring girl of fabulous beauty. In time, Christopher began to talk. He turned out to be a jack of all trades. He quickly learned to build, put up a log cabin for his own Scarlett, and furnished it. And so they lived together. Vague pictures of the past surfaced, but nothing made sense. With some secret excitement, he looked at the frost, and then all was eclipsed by lethargy. The memories went no further. Christopher was no longer himself. He was given a new name, William, slipped the papers of a long dead man, buried but not registered as dead. William Davidovich Redfill was born. For a long time he couldn't remember where he came from, who he worked for, or why he was on that road. and Julia was still waiting for her son's return. Her motherly heart told her he was alive. It had been 5 years since his disappearance. Christopher had been reported missing. The bleak days dragged on. It seemed as if nothing would happen until she died. Then one day she received a letter. A very strange message came from the village of Chaslevoix from Linda. On a white sheet of paper was written only one word: monkey. What nonsense! Julia shook the envelope. Nothing more than that. A gap. On the window, the sheet was blank. That's what I said. She's a mad fool, she muttered. That same day, she left for the village. The first thing she did was to go to Linda's house. She didn't remember at all her son's story about how he met his wife. This time, the door to the house was thrown open wide. It was empty inside. Julia walked through the rooms. It didn't look like anyone lived here. Dust, cobwebs, the smell of damp in the corners. A long, uninhabited dwelling. But in the midst of this emptiness, on the windowsill stood a tattered portrait of a sweet little girl. Julia shuddered and cried. Christopher's bottomless blue eyes were staring at her. She grabbed the portrait, read the inscription at the bottom, Mary, on the back, Mary Christopher Redfield. Can't be. How could it be? For 5 years I've been alone, with my granddaughter growing up next to me. All because of Linda, the village witch. All because of her. She took away my son and hid my granddaughter. What a bastard. Julia howled as she stared at the photograph, stroking the face that bore the features of her precious Christopher. Then she sat down and burst into tears. Tears of remorse flowed in streams. It was she herself who had kicked the good girl out without complaint. She had given her wormwood to keep her from becoming a mother. But what a cruel fate. Linda gave her a daughter and took everything away from her. It's karma. Linda shouldn't have treated her like that. It was getting dark. There was no electricity in the house, so this wasn't where her sister-in-law lived. Julia stood up from the floor, frozen for 5 years, her heart bleeding. Anxious thoughts lingered. She walked to her mother's house. Here, too, the door was thrown open wide. No one inside, empty and desolate. She hadn't been to her hometown of Sunset Valley in a year. She'd given up hope of finding her son and stopped calling. Without her, her mother must have died. No one else in the world. I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm sorry. Where are you? Julia said, clutching her temples, and fell senseless. She woke up in the dark. The door was cold. She had to find her granddaughter and ask Linda what was wrong with her mother. There was no electricity in the house. She went into the kitchen. As they had been when she was a child, candles lay in a drawer. Julia lit one, set down a glass, and sat alone in the semi-darkness in the chair where she had sat as a small, carefree, mischievous girl 45 years ago, the glare playing on the wall. The silence was incredible. The world froze here in an instant. Not rushed, not demanding sacrifice. What had happened to her soul? The city had taken everything good out of her, made her a cruel city girl. And it's not square meters, water from the tap that you need to stay alive. That's the feeling when you realize you're a real person. Only the countryside can reveal the soul. Julia should have been born again. Sitting alone on that chair in the semi-darkness, where her mother had not thrown it away because she had waited all her life for her daughter's return. In that moment she came home with her whole soul. The grief helped to make sense of the emptiness of her meaningless life in those short hours, as if counting down the time of rebirth. Night had fallen. Business had to be postponed until tomorrow. Julia unraveled her black braid and brushed it out. In the morning she woke with the dawn. Anxiously she opened the closet in her former room, went through the dresses she had worn when she was young. This was where she had lived until she was married, until she met a promising boyfriend who had become a lawyer. Later they had already left the village, bought an apartment in the city. The clothes were too small. Julia slammed the closet doors. She went into her mother's room, pulled back the closet. There were rows and rows of weekend dresses, all in perfect order, on parade, even the perfume still on. It was an old habit of her mother's to walk around the village only in skirts or dresses. Julia stood in indecision. Taking her mother's things, Julia didn't dare. It wasn't clear what had happened. It was bad luck to wear the belongings of the deceased, but surely she would have been informed if her mother had died. With that thought in mind, she cheerfully selected a plain, straight-cut monochrome dress and changed, taking off her pantsuit she had arrived in. Angrily, she tossed the suit into the dresser. Like a frog, she took off her skin, transforming herself into a beautiful maiden. Julia was a slender, beautiful woman in her 50s, but her strict outfits and dark clothes made her look old. Now she was happily fidgeting in front of the mirror, as if she were a dozen years younger in this simple, old-fashioned dress. It was time to make inquiries, stock up on groceries, and get the house in order. She went out into the street. The wonderful country air made her dizzy. After standing, enjoying the silence, Julia walked to the next house. She wondered why she hadn't thought to go there earlier in the evening. "Hello, Rosemary," said the old landlady when she saw Julia in her neighbor's dress. "Have a good day to you too?" Silence, continued the old lady. "Tell me, where's my mother? With a daughter like that, you can't die." "Fate, it can't be. You, my dear, do not deserve to know the truth," said the neighbor harshly, turning away. "Tell me, I beg you very much, is she alive?" Rosemary stood up, picked up her club, and walked to the porch. The silence lengthened. "She's alive. You get out of here. I have nothing more to say. Don't come here. I won't say anything else. It's up to you to decide how you want to live your life." "Dylan," I shouted loudly, "we'll send Peggy out to graze, and we'll send this one out too," she muttered under her breath, but Julia heard her. She had accomplished nothing more. Dylan, the neighbor's son, passed by without looking or speaking. Julia stood for a moment, then angrily strode away. She passed 5 other neighbors. 2 had already left the village. Their houses were boarded up, their vegetable gardens abandoned, all overgrown with grass in the height of summer. The other 2 neighbors she knew couldn't explain anything, saying that her mother had moved away, but she wouldn't say where. But the village was thriving. A new store had opened. People were farming, putting the cattle out to pasture. The hospital was working. On the local bulletin board, there was a poster advertising a recreation center by the river. The villagers' inquiries were fruitless. Julia decided she had to make a fresh start. Not for nothing received a strange message: the portrait of her granddaughter will change, earn forgiveness. Fate, the girl laughed at her. She decided to start with a temporary move. "I rented an apartment in the city, put it on the alarm system. That way she wouldn't have to worry." But she didn't take almost any things with her. Her old taste seemed unacceptable for the countryside. Julia went to the stores and bought suitable clothes for work and everyday life. She spent the rest of the evening tidying up the household, going through the kitchen utensils. Everything was in a poor state of repair. The old things were old. The wallpaper had not been changed for years. Now she realized how much worse the house was in need of repair. She hadn't thought about it, leaving her mother alone in the village. She only threw in a pittance occasionally, sending money a couple times a year. How her mother lived here alone was incomprehensible. And a bitter thought befell the negligent daughter: what if her son had left her alone like that? Would it be easy for her to live? Her heart was troubled. How could she do such a thing? No, she deserved everything that had happened to her. You can't be selfish, thinking only of yourself. Everything will be different now, she proclaimed into the void, wiping away her tears. Julia spent the rest of the evening cleaning the house. She made a list of things to buy in town. Figured she'd go to the village hall to find out when her mother had last paid the light bill. It turned out that the bills had been paid only 3 months ago. The landlady herself came to Linda's house, and she was treated warily, but the payment was accepted. In the evening, the electricity came on, illuminating the rooms with a cold, dim light. In the morning, Julia packed for the city. She drove her car to the village, leaving it at the gate for the night. But after thinking for a while, she went to her neighbor's house, snuck into the house, knocked. It was open. The house was clean, spacious, everything was in order. Her son had done his best to repair the house. Julia felt ashamed that she had never helped anyone. The angry landlady was about to send her away. "Rosemary, I'm sorry. I was mean. It was my fault," Julia said. "What a sly fox," grinned the neighbor. I won't tell you anything. You know you're right. It's too early to forgive your mother. I must find my son and granddaughter before them I am guilty. So why did you come to me? Go back to your place. No one needs you here. I've decided to stay here for the summer. I've been invited, Julia muttered quietly, remembering the letter from her. What do you want? I'm going into town to do some repairs on my mother's house. I came here to ask if there's anything you need to buy. Buy whatever Rosemary decides. The neighbors smirked slyly. What are you, from the bottom of my heart? Can I help you? Oh, my dear, suddenly smiled neighbor. I can't pretend to be angry for long. Come to me. I babysat you while your mother was at work. To her great amazement, all of her aunt's admitted sternness did not go away. She hugged Julia, wiping away her tears. Wait till I write you a list. And I have to ask my son. He wanted to go to town too. Maybe he could come with you. Rosemary's son was a little older than Julia. As children, they were friends and quarrelsome, annoying each other with various mischief. At 15, Dylan left his mother and went to school to become an electrician. Then he came back, got a job here, got married, made an addition to the house. We had a household, we lived together. How painful it was for her mother to see it. Her daughter got married and never came back. Hey, Dylan. Julia finally found the right words. Hi from the hatch. Dylan smiled, remembering her past offenses. Come on, don't bring up old times. I'm going to town. Your mother made a list. Maybe you should go too. Will you come with me? You're not at the robbery, Julia said. The irony was uncalled for. When she was a kid, she'd thrown herself behind the wheel of his motorcycle, but she'd lost control. Drove off a bridge into a river, and they were rescued. They banned the bike. Dylan didn't forgive her for that and stopped talking to her altogether. He'd do little things, like scare me with caterpillars or throw mice. Don't worry, I've been driving for 20 years, said Rosemary. My husband gave me a car for my wedding, and I learned right away. And you buried your husband? Dylan asked. My mother told me. God rest his soul. I'm sorry. What you reminded? Rosemary sighed. Nothing. Where did your wife die? Went out on the ice in the spring, trying to rinse her laundry. It sucked her in. She wasn't rescued, Dylan said quietly. Dylan said quietly, looking away. I'm sorry, I didn't realize it was a long time ago. Let's go to town. Wait, I've changed. While Dylan was getting ready, a girl with a bag over her shoulder ran up to Linda. Hello. Do you live in this house? Yeah, I'm here to see my mother. Yeah, here's a letter to this address. Sign here, please. Thank you, girl. Come and visit if you have time. I have to go. Goodbye. On the light-colored envelope was her mother's address, but it was addressed to Julia. Julia opened it anxiously. Was someone trying to teach her a lesson or take revenge? On the white sheet of paper in large letters was a single word, wormwood. Julia shrieked, dropped the sheet. Linda had learned that her mother-in-law's evil deeds could have left her barren. How could that be? Could she have peeked at her while Linda was in the kitchen making herbal tea for her daughter-in-law? What are you standing there for? You got your mouth open? Dylan asked, approaching and seeing the leaf. He picked it up, reading the strange message in amazement. What is this nonsense? Did you get a letter? Your correspondent is obviously not very verbal. Dylan laughed, but quickly stopped, seeing that Julia stood in a daze with a lost look. Let's go. The road was silent. They didn't even turn on the music. Dylan dozed in the passenger seat, then opened his eyes. Your mother came to see us a week ago. What? Julia braked hard, almost hitting Dylan's forehead. She's feeling better. You guys get in. I'd rather walk. You're being a bit of a jerk. I'm sorry. But why didn't Aunt Rosemary tell me? I was so worried. Do you know what I've been through? I've already buried her in my mind. Don't yell. What's going on? Julia said it quietly, pulling over to the curb. I don't know. They were whispering in the kitchen without me. And my mother forbade me to talk about it. Don't ask me anything. I'm gonna go, Linda said. Here we go. Wait. I'll find out for myself. Don't say anything. Let's go. The shopping trip took longer than they thought. It was getting dark by the time they filled the trunk and the back seats. Julia talked Dylan into spending the night at her apartment. He walked around the rooms for a long time, looking amazed. It's like a museum. What kind of place is this? You must be crazy to live in the country. There's a living room as big as your mother's house. Yes, my mother lives in poverty and my daughter lives in luxury. Patricia's herding the flock is marvelous. Dylan, I know everything. Calm down, Julia stopped him. You'll sleep on the couch, come on. I'll feed you, but I won't give you caviar. I'll feed you, you furry hedgehog. Dylan replied playfully. Julia thought that it was unbearable to live alone. Caring for others gave her energy. Dylan was thoughtful, looking at his mistress with respect. The evening was not going well. The guest was obviously hiding something from her. But Linda didn't ask any more. The letters led her to some goal, like stages of tests she had to pass. In the early morning, Dylan got up, lifting Julia. He never left his mother alone for long. He had to help with the chores. They came back when the neighbor had already put the cow out to graze. Why didn't you come back yesterday? Every hour counts. I can't cope anymore. And it's getting scary to spend the night alone, the neighbor said. And then she smiled and invited us to tea. They unloaded the shopping. Julia brought a set of pots and pans as a gift for her neighbor. She knew that cookware is the main problem of village housewives. Rosemary went to deny, but accepted the gift. The hut was clean, cozy, warm. The hostess brewed tea, put a film with lambs, jam, and honey. A quiet morning in the village, peaceful. Julia sipped her tea. She looked at her hostess with bewilderment, remembering something. And I suppose you were bitter. I suppose others had a sweet life? Remember that with wormwood? Julia choked. Rosemary was coughing and crying. You eat it with jam from the freezer. You eat it with jam from the freezer. It'll be less bitter, she said with a sly squint. Julia shuddered. Tears ran down her cheeks, and she jumped up and ran out without looking at anyone. This had never happened before. Nothing disturbed her heart. She had easily done mischief to her sister-in-law. But now a long dormant conscience woke up and troubled her soul. Julia sat on the bench at the gate and could not calm down for a long time. There were no thoughts in her head, only tears flowed unrestrainedly, washing away the blackness that lived in her soul. Nancy's granddaughter was to take away the bitterness of life. A little while later, Julia began to unpack. Then she fiddled in the kitchen until evening, took everything out to the veranda, painted the ceiling and walls, deciding to wallpaper. She just mopped the floors. She had a rug, contrary to village tradition. The old kitchen furniture was falling apart, needing repair. Julia persuaded Dylan to help, who willingly patched the holes. He's a real piece of work. In his 50s and early 50s, he's still got the skill to work with his hands, Julia said with admiration. Dylan laughed at the carpet and told him to paint the floors. You can help me organize the furniture. It's up to me to decide what to do. You city folk are all cuckoo. Linda dismissed him. Oh, for crying out loud. All right, let the carpet be for now, and I'll have the floors repainted later. You'll throw that carpet away in 3 days. Let's see how hot you get at the river. I bought a vacuum cleaner. You've never even heard of it? Dylan gave Linda a friendly look, a playful nudge, a playful look. Oh, Dylan, stop pushing me around. Oh, Dylan, stop pushing me around. We don't have time for that. We have grandchildren to babysit. You didn't let me babysit my former grandchildren, he said bitterly. The son of a border guard, he doesn't show his nose at home. It's been 10 years since we've seen each other. Son, I don't know anything about you. I don't know about anyone. I took care of myself. Only my son is left. After his mother died, he cut off all contact with us. He left, as if he disappeared into thin air. He writes letters once a year. What's wrong with that? He's made his own arrangements. He got an apartment in the Far East. But he didn't have a family, Julia said pityingly and hugged Dylan. He suddenly responded, hugged her and kissed her on the lips. Linda was taken aback. "Are you crazy in your old age? You don't know anything. I was in love with you when I was a kid, and Madeline, the town freak, was the first one to jump on me. I don't need any more help from you. I'll see you around," Dylan muttered. He turned and walked away. "Right, you're going to teach them a lesson, aren't you?" Linda called out to him. "What's mine? Wait, you can't talk here." Dylan came up to Julia, kissed her again, and quickly left. She stood in a daze for a minute, then sat down to drink tea in the newly transformed kitchen, sparkling clean. Dylan had hung the chandelier she'd envisioned, installed a floor clock with a pendulum on the wall, adding to the coziness. Only the old set spoiled the overall impression. So the furniture was worth updating. Linda could order new sofas, a wall, an armchair, a bed for her mom. How easy were these things to do now? Why hadn't she thought about mom's comfort before? For a week, Julia made repairs, ordered furniture. While she waited for delivery, she painted the ceilings and walls. For more than 10 years, she sat on the couch with soap operas, and now she worked, impressing the neighbors unprecedented for a mature woman's vigor. Her back and arms ached in the evenings, but Julia didn't complain. She endured, glad that God had given her the strength for such an important work. During that week, Dylan visited her more than once, helping with cabinet repairs and rearranging furniture. Julia got used to him, communication became warm, he often stayed late. They remembered the past, made plans. But about Linda's mother, Dylan refused to talk. At parting, he hugged her like his own, but he did not allow himself any liberties, kissing her innocently on the cheek. On the 8th day, the renovation was finished. The old cabinets from the kitchen were dismantled for firewood. For her mother, Julia chose non-tarnished furniture of a pleasant gray shade, which gave the kitchen a new glow. The house sparkled with magical colors with new furniture, fluffy carpets. Julia put all her energies into the renovation and, exhausted of energy, fell asleep on the new sofa. She woke up to a knock on the door. The postmistress Patricia came. The game was dragging on. The family sent a package. Julia opened it anxiously. This time there was no message, just 2 jars with some contents. She opened it carefully, tasted it. Wormwood and the same thing. It's a vicious circle. I chose the right path as a mother a long time ago. I did the repairs. I realized what a despicable thing I'd done to my family. I lost my son. Tell me, haven't we suffered enough? Didn't we? I'm sorry, it's early. It's early, Julia said. Didn't you understand? Came Dylan's voice. Didn't you lock the door? They're going to steal my beauty. Scared you? Linda flinched. The door? Oh, that doesn't make any sense. What didn't I realize? You have to lock the door. That's not what I meant. You just said you didn't get it. Are you all kidding me? Nobody. You did this all yourself. You did all this renovation. If you don't want to tell me, don't tell me. Just go. Don't make a mess. I'm here. We need help with the household chores. My mom asked me to. All right, I'll come back in an hour. Dylan stomped around for a while and came out. Julia made breakfast, working out in her head the problem she'd been given. If Linda knows about her intrigues, Julia has to go through it too. First to feel the bitterness of life, and then there would be hope and a path in the distance. Her granddaughter Svetlova kept saying, and drank the jar of wormwood infusion to the bottom. She choked, took a drink of water, and collapsed without feeling. By evening, Dylan found Julia sleeping soundly in the kitchen. There was no way to wake her. He carried her to the hall and put her on the sofa. Linda looked charming in her sleep. Dylan decided to stay close to her, to wait for her to wake up, so he locked the door. He went into the kitchen. His eye caught a jar of some kind of potion. He sniffed something familiar. He remembered the inscription in the letter he'd recently received. Wormwood. Dylan thought that Julia's mother had continued the punishment, but he wouldn't interfere. Let things run their course. They say Julia herself had been scheming against her daughter-in-law for a year and a half, playing with her fate and her relationship with her son. Dylan turned off the light and lay down on the bed in the bedroom. He fell asleep quickly, a sound, healthy sleep. Julia woke up when there was deep darkness outside the window. She was surprised that she had no memory of the previous day at all. Opening her eyes, Julia squealed with horror. There was a dark silhouette standing on her doorstep. She ran to the bedroom, closed the door, sighed, looked at the bed, and a scream caught in her throat. In the semi-darkness, she saw Linda sitting with her legs overhung. She was pointing her finger, whispering that Julia had ruined her unborn children. Linda fell to her knees. "I'm sorry," Linda, the frightened woman, pleaded. "I pray to God. I'm guilty everywhere, but I don't hold a grudge." An ominous silence was her answer. When Julia looked up in fear, she saw that there was no Linda, but a man sleeping on the bed. She jumped up, a pounding in her temples. Her head was spinning. She listened in silence. It was only when she looked out into the living room that she realized there was no one there. Turning on the bedroom light, Julia breathed a sigh of relief. "Dylan, how you frightened me." But he was sleeping soundly as a baby, not awakened by her cries. Turning off the light, Julia went into the kitchen. There was still someone standing at the threshold, a dark silhouette. It walked quickly toward Julia. Dazed with horror, she skidded back into the bedroom, but there stood her mother with an angry expression on her face, moved her whole body, approaching, threatening her with her finger. "Why did you have children, you naughty daughter? You've ruined everyone's life. You yourself are wearing silk. You didn't think about your mother." "Mommy, don't. I'm sorry, don't swear, I'll fix it. Everything will be different," Julia begged. Her mother had almost reached her and held out her hands. Dylan woke up. He saw Julia staring into the void and whispering in a frantic plea for forgiveness. "Julia, what are you doing?" She finally saw that there was no one in the room but Dylan. His shout cleared her eyes, but the fear remained. "There's someone in the hallway," Julia whispered. "You're a mess," Dylan said, shaking his head. "You should take less of that stuff." "Why did you take wormwood last night?" "Wormwood doesn't give you visions. It was spiked." "That's right. And you knocked over the second bottle," Linda said. Julia flinched. Linda was talking to her. "Monkeys, monkeys eat." Linda laughed. "Oh my God, I'm imagining things again. Do you have a headache?" "Impossible," Julia said. "Let's go to Mommy. She'll tell you what to do. Take the jar." Julia obediently got ready. She could still hear footsteps in the house. Shadows seemed to lurk in the corners. She fumbled around, grabbing Dylan's arm. Without letting go of him, they came to Rosemary's room. She picked up the jar, took it, and laughed. "Well, my dear, how long will you dream of things? A mushroom for a mushroom. That's what you should have called the potion." Rosemary laughed again, but sat the guests down. She fiddled with the herbs and poured some fragrant tea. "Here, drink this. It'll make you feel better." "You must have a headache," she said to Julia. "Thank you." "I hope it doesn't make me quite," Julia mumbled. "If you don't want to, don't drink and get out of here," Rosemary said sharply. "Why are you acting so strangely? You're persecuting me and helping me." "Julia, remember the main truth: everything can be forgiven, but guilt in front of an innocent child cannot atone." At home, Dylan gave Julia a lecture. Said that today he would not babysit her. He would come back in the evening. The woman entered the house anxiously, not noticing anything suspicious. Her head ached hardly at all. She felt like going to sleep. Julia fell asleep quickly, barely putting her head on the pillow. She was awakened by her own voice. "Hello, daughter." Her mother was sitting on the edge of the couch. "Mommy, hello, hello. How I missed you," Julia exclaimed. "How beautiful you've made it. Would you have done it before?" "It was so nice," replied her mother. "Mom, I'm sorry," Julia cried, and tried to get up but couldn't. She forcefully crawled on the couch and opened her eyes. The whole pillow was wet. There was no one in the house. "I was dreaming," she whispered. "But Mom, we'll meet. In fact, I'll change everything." Her head was still heavy, dizzy and aching in her temples. Julia walked to the kitchen, took a jar of jam, tasted it automatically, struggled to do her household chores. Having moved, she decided to cook something tasty, to make pies to treat Dylan in the evening. She had a secret liking for her neighbor Christopher. He was as at ease with her as if he were her own. After an hour, she was surprised to note that her headache was gone and her consciousness was clear. A burst of strength and appetite reminded her that she was quite well. Monkey helped monkey, because after the tea I had dreams, Julia said. Julia started a new phase of her life and decided to find something to do to keep busy. She used to work for her husband at the prosecutor's office as a secretary. Together with Christopher's father, they had made a fortune and had become respected people in the city. But now Julia realized that no luxury could replace family. The longing for her son, the desire to see her granddaughter and meet her mother had become the main value of her life. It was getting dark. Julia cooked goodies and waited for Dylan to arrive. Then she got angry and decided to go to bed. There was a knock at the door, but instead of a neighbor came a girl who handed Julia an envelope and disappeared. This made Julia angry. She wanted to throw the letter away, but she overpowered herself, sat down and printed the message. There are many roads to redemption, but unfortunately not all of them are peaceful. Julia read aloud. Sounds like a threat. It's my job to scare you, came a man's voice over her ear. Who's there? Julia shrieked in horror and jumped up sharply. Dylan laughed. You're sincerely making fun of me, Julia rebuked him. Did you do it on purpose? I was baking you pies. You're not getting any. Get out of here. I'm an old woman, I have nerves. I have a weak heart. If I don't live to see my son and granddaughter, you'll be responsible for this sin. Just so you know, mark my words. You just cursed me, Dylan grinned. You should close the door. What's the fashion for you to swoop in like a witch? I'll go. Good night, madwoman. Wait, sit down, eat. Woof, what are you doing? Well, you give me as a dog commands. Julia was outraged. Okay, sorry, I'm kidding. Get your pies. Okay, but don't scare me again. Next time, I'm sure I'll give my soul to God, without fail. You've got another 30 years on you, Dylan laughed. What kind of treatment is that? Are there no other words for me? There are. But you'll like them even less, Dylan replied. Shut up. It's scary to imagine what's going on in your head, Dylan said with a sudden change of tone. Then he added with a smirk, you, my love, are like a splinter in my head. Julia choked on her tea and coughed up tears. She wanted to say something. Instead, she sat silently, her eyes wide. You're out of your mind, Dylan grumbled. He hadn't expected such a reaction. He wanted mutual recognition, a warm relationship. He wanted Julia to lower her eyes demurely, take his hand, and tell him that she needed him. An indignant Dylan jumped up and ran outside. Julia straightened up in her chair. She hadn't expected such a reaction from herself. She considered herself a reserved lady. Where did she get this country bumpkin attitude from? Silly, she thought. The next morning, ashamed to remember last night, Julia fulfilled the promise she had made to herself. Before lunch, she went around the city looking for work. Everywhere she was offered only temporary help in the household. Then she resolutely went home and changed her clothes. Redemption is what was needed, she repeated to herself the words of the letter. The first thing Julia did was to stop by Rosemary's house and help her with the vegetable garden. Then she went around to the neighbors to make life easier for the elderly. She didn't take money for her work, and she refused to buy food. It was dark when Julia returned home. Her back ached, but she felt happy. For the first time in days, she felt proud. As she approached the porch, she heard some rustling behind the house. A dark figure. Was she imagining it? Deciding to see what was there, Julia took a few steps and suddenly fell into a hole. She hit her head on something hard and lost consciousness. When she woke up, Julia couldn't tell what time of day it was. It was completely dark. She twisted her head around and tried to get up. When she hit something, she shrieked and felt around, and there were wooden walls everywhere, with planks on top. She was trapped in some kind of box. A cold, sickening feeling of fear and hopelessness scared Julia to death. Help me. Help me. Help me. Help me. she screamed, hysterical. It seemed to her as if an eternity had passed, and at last her body quieted. Her head was splitting with pain. Taking a full breath, Julia calmed down. She remembered the words of the letter, "Not all paths to redemption are peaceful." "This is too much, too much. You can't torture a man like this. You can't," Julia screamed and cried, pounding on the walls of the box. Then she noticed that the lid was sliding open. Julia put her hands and head against it and with an effort opened it. The daylight blinded her eyes, which were unaccustomed to brightness. She blinked, then stood up. Her heart nearly stopped with horror. She was standing in a grave, in a coffin, in a cemetery. Gathering her last strength, Julia began to climb out of the grave. At that time, an inebriated watchman came running to her screams. When he saw someone climbing out of the grave, he almost had a stroke. But he still ran up and managed to push Julia back when she was almost out. "Damn zombie. You've got a heart, but you've got an ugly face. Where did your kin put you?" muttered the watchman. Despair seized the unhappy woman, but she guessed to speak calmly. "Grandfather, grandfather," she cautiously called the watchman. "This is the work of the evil power. Lord, forgive me sinful, I repent, I swear I won't drink anymore. Grandfather, I'm alive, I fell here. I came to visit my family, and here's this open grave. Grandpa, help me, please." "Cunning, pretending to be a human being," said the watchman cautiously. He looked into the grave and saw Julia in black work clothes, with her hair tangled and loose. "Help me, you idiot, you damned bastard. Help me out of here. Get me out of here at once," Julia whispered in helplessness, like a hiss. "Holy Mother of God," the guard exclaimed fearfully and ran away, making the sign of the cross. "Go on, you heartless man. Get out yourself," he said. At the third attempt, Julia got out of the grave. The cemetery was deserted, with a field beyond. A narrow path led somewhere. But where was the village? It was hard to figure out. The paths to redemption are far from peaceful. How did I even end up here? How could anyone do this to a living person? Julia pondered. She sat down by the roadside and began brushing her hair, which seemed to be purposely knotted and tangled in the ominous silence of the cemetery. Thoughts of life and death came into her head. Here is the end of everyone's life, the grave. How much of us is empty, unnecessary, superfluous, and all of us have the same end in a hole under the ground. Lying on the damp earth, Julia thought, as long as I'm alive, I need to think about more than just myself. She didn't cry. She just accepted it. Washed, go down that path over there, as if the road was telling her. Or to a new life one must pass. Maybe this is the path of redemption, not a peaceful one. Mommy, tell me, you're the one who played games with me. How could you do this to me?" Julia knew the answer. She had forgotten the way to her mother's house. It was time to return to the place where her soul would be born again. In her mind, she forgave her mother for everything. It was important to go through this redemption, any hardship. It was necessary to beg forgiveness. The path led to the road, but no one passed by. After 15 minutes, Julia was exhausted. She was thirsty. Her legs ached. She sat down on the side of the road to wait for a car. A tractor showed up. By a fateful coincidence, Max was behind the wheel. He agreed to give Julia a ride to the village for a small fee. As she sat down next to him, she breathed a sigh of relief. Then she noticed a familiar backpack at his feet. Julia leaned over and was horrified to see the secret embroidery on the strap, which she herself had custom-made for her son. "Explain at once where you got that from?" she asked sharply, stopping the tractor. "I found this backpack by the roadside, picked it up." "It was a long time ago," Max replied. "I don't remember when. Tell me the truth." Julia slapped the driver. Max did not tolerate it, got out and threw the woman out of the tractor with force, and then drove away. Julia made her way to the village in tears. She was determined to find out about the backpack. The hope of finding her son loomed ahead. His backpack was here, which meant Liam was coming not far away. He and Linda must be messing with me, Julia thought. When she got home, she locked herself in the dark and fell into a heavy, restless sleep. Dylan came to her more than once, but he couldn't get through to her. Julia woke for the first time late in the afternoon. She heated water and washed herself properly. She ate with appetite. Life was coming back to her. The apathy of the last few days had subsided. Julia got dressed and picked up her papers, deciding to go to the police station. Hello. 5 years ago, my son went to the village of Rodnoy but never returned. Wait. The officers on duty will call the district police officer to you and make a statement with him, Julia was told. An hour later, the woman was invited to the office. Hello, Kevin. This is the district commissioner. What do you want to see us about? The man asked. Julia detailed the events of 5 years ago and described yesterday's incident with the backpack. She was asked to write a statement and promised to look into it. In the evening, she received a phone call and was told to come to the station. They refused to search for her. No good. Here's a brand new backpack with no embroidery. They searched the house, found nothing, Kevin said, showing the backpack. A clever man figured out what was going on. He got rid of his son's things, burned them in the backyard. Julia got nowhere. The trail went cold, but she didn't take a statement. Your Liam's missing, the precinct officer said harshly, shooing the woman away. But Julia didn't give up. She decided to turn to Dylan for help. She needed to nail Max to the wall, but the neighbor refused to help. Are you crazy? Just live in peace. Everything will work itself out. Don't you understand? That's my son's backpack. I haven't seen him in 5 years. This bastard's obviously up to something. If you don't help me, I'll go to him myself. You can't stop. And anyway, where were you yesterday? Wandering around the vegetable gardens again? Yes, I was helping. Digging underground. Julia didn't want to say anything to scare Dylan. I'll be honest, it's a great distraction from my darkest thoughts. They stood in the doorway, embracing each other as if they were young, with all the burdens lifted from their shoulders. People who had passed the test, forgiven each other for the present and the past. Dylan and Julia made no secret of their relationship. Rosemary took it calmly, only told them to help with household chores as before. 2 days after the cemetery came a new message. Julia was already waiting for it. She opened it without excitement. It was a postcard with an invitation to visit the vacation home by the river. Dylan took the news calmly. Rosemary sighed mysteriously, smiled imperceptibly. They both knew the landlady of this inn. Julia was waiting for the last test. No matter how much she begged, Dylan refused to go with her and remained adamant. Julia hastily packed, took the invitation card and set off on her journey. It was a short drive, about an hour on a country road. Then the path changed, and it became more difficult to drive in the field. Every now and then the car bounced on the bumps. Finally they arrived. The rest house, which occupied an impressive space, appeared. Several hunting lodges and a 2-story building were located along the river. At the gate, the guard let Julia through without question. Pulling into the grounds, she read the name. In bright red letters on the hull, it read Morocco. 5 years ago, Linda Svetlova found herself on the street because of her mother-in-law's sneaky schemes. The biggest blow was the betrayal of her husband. He did not believe her, did not support her, threw her out as a mean woman. Linda couldn't bear it. Her heart was broken. There was no point in living any longer. Without a shadow of a doubt, she stepped into the road, but a man passing nearby pushed her away a second before the irreparable happened. Linda's head was only slightly bumped, but she was still taken to the hospital. The doctor told the unbelievable news the girl was pregnant. Only this saved Linda from the terrible pain in her heart. She wiped her tears and decided to live against fate. Linda did not want to return to her husband. She could not forgive his betrayal. There was only one way left to her homeland, to her native village. When she returned, she put the house in order and cried for 5 days after being locked up. She had to organize her life for the sake of her child. Linda pulled herself together. She went into town, quit her job at the store. Peggy, Christopher's grandmother, the same Maria Ilinichna, met Linda at the store and told her to tell the truth. They were more than just neighbors. Linda often helped Peggy in the household, came to visit her. The girl became family to this woman. But Julia did not know this and did not see beyond her nose. In the evening, pregnant Linda could not resist and told Peggy for a long time what she had been through for a year and a half. The neighbor cried, unable to believe her own daughter's meanness. Then the old woman took Linda in to help her through this difficult time. The girl got a job in a bakery and managed to help her patroness. When Julia came looking for traces or news, her sister-in-law was in the next room. She was also the one who bribed the villagers to make her mother-in-law think Linda had not returned to the village. Not for a second did the daughter-in-law feel sorry for her mother-in-law, but the news about Christopher alarmed her. She began to search for him. Her first attempts to find her husband proved futile. 7 months later, Linda gave birth to a daughter and named her Madeline. One day, walking on the bank of the river, the girl thought how good it is in the village to rest from the city. After all, it is a very good idea to build a house on the shore so that the townspeople could rest in it. This thought she shared with Peggy. To Peggy's great surprise, she brought the whole 2 million wrapped in a dish towel. Wow. How did you get so rich? I've been saving. Julia used to give me money like a dog. I couldn't spend it. She didn't set eyes on me for 5 years. Christopher used to come and leave me some money too. I'd save it up. I'd give it to a good cause or a church. I don't need anything myself. Take it. I'm sorry to you. I've been suffering because of my daughter. Thank you, Linda said. It's not just for me, it's for you and a good cause. After consulting a lawyer from the city, Linda got a permit and bought a plot of land by the river. The first house came out small. At first, she didn't think it would be anything worthwhile. She advertised in town and people showed up. They bought places 2 months in advance. A year later, they built 2 two-story buildings and added hunting cabins. The demand did not fall, and the profit grew. For the summer, Linda and her grandmother moved to a cabin built especially for them. All the while, the girl continued her search. She knew that Christopher never came home. He had been expelled from his job because of his long absence. Linda traveled all over the neighborhood in search of her husband. One day, she remembered the God-forsaken village of Red Lion, who lived under the name of William. Scraps recalled the past. Once he easily settled a dispute between the men, reading from the former lines from the laws. After that, the villagers began to go to him for minor matters, to secure their property by law or to formalize the land, to fill out documents. It became clear that more than just a guest was being sheltered. Over time, Christopher grew cold toward his common-law wife. An unknown anxiety overtook his soul. He went to the river all day long, wistfully remembered the same village, grandmother, paintings. The past life was gradually coming back to him. Roberta immediately realized that William began to avoid her. The stern girl packed her things and returned to her mother. Linda did not even think of returning him. He only brought suffering with his indifference. There, in the depths of memories, awoke the feeling of a mysterious girl with a basket of flowers. He saw her in a dream, walking along the road. Then all was cut short by a black cloth. So he was tormented for another 6 months in fragments, remembering the past, trying to find out where he was found. And the next day, without informing anyone of his plans, he got ready to go to the village of Rodno. In the morning, he got up early, got on his motorcycle and drove away. Almost 2 years had passed since he had crashed before reaching his destination. Now he knew for sure that this journey had to be completed. That same day, Linda arrived in the village of Krasnoye. She went around 5 yards before they dared to tell her the truth about the accident. Linda was taken to Christopher's house, but no one was there. The villagers waved goodbye and invited her to visit. She could finally tell them who they had taken in. "He's from our village," they said. Christopher pulled onto the road, read the signs, looked around. Then he looked at the cars that occasionally passed by. He instantly refreshed his memories of that fateful day when a tractor had driven into him on this very spot. "Linda," a sharp pain stabbed at his heart. "How could you be without me?" He guessed that the whole misfortune had befallen them only because of his own mother. One planted packet of pills and a fictitious note had ruined entire families' lives. Christopher took a long time to come to his senses, hesitant to continue on his way. He walked between the trees, climbing out of the abyss he'd been living in for the past 2 years. It was like coming out of a coma. Finally, he decided to go to his grandmother to cheer and comfort her. It seemed to him that an eternity had passed. When he reached the doorstep of his grandmother, he ran into the veranda. Toward him, hearing the motorcycle, Peggy ran out. Both were crying and laughing. "Christopher, you're alive, sweetheart. I believed you'd come back, that you were alive," she exclaimed. "Let me look at you. You've grown up so much, and I'm still the same as my grandmother." "Don't cry. It's all right. Everything will be different now," answered Christopher. "And you rascal, how could you torture us for 2 years? Didn't your heart ache? Didn't you feel sorry for your family?" "I just remembered you today. Grandma, where's Linda? Did she come looking for you?" "You don't know anything," Peggy said, and led him into the house. Christopher saw a little girl looking at him with clear blue eyes. "Daughter," he breathed out and choked back bitter tears. "I kicked out my pregnant wife. For 2 years she was alone without me." The girl shook her uncle's hand and ran off to play. She did not immediately get used to strangers, brought up by her mother and grandmother. She was too young to understand the complexities of life. "Where's Linda? Did she go looking for you?" "She's been looking all the time. She went to Red," Peggy said. Christopher shuddered, realizing that he had missed his wife and that fate was confusing them. He decided to wait here for her return and had a long talk with his grandmother. Peggy told him bitterly, "Your mother, Julia, not only Linda, but your other girls were scared away from you, from your son. She once even confessed in a fit of despair how she had separated you from Linda, how she had written that letter in your name, how she wanted to make her infertile." Christopher could hardly believe his mother had arranged such meanness. A lump came to his throat. He shouldn't have believed his wife defending his mother. Because of her, he almost lost the life of his wife and daughter. "Granny, you can't let it go. You can't let it go. You can't. I don't want to see her again. I don't want to know her." Linda returned late that night. As she approached the house, she saw Christopher's motorcycle, burst into tears and rushed into the house. Linda rushed in and threw herself around Christopher's neck because she knew her lover had not betrayed her. Peggy ran to her mother and began beating Christopher with her palms, afraid that her uncle would hurt her mother. They decided to all live together, but they moved into a vacation home that needed owner supervision. Peggy stayed on, promising to move in with her grandson and great-granddaughter later. The vacation home prospered, growing. Christopher's help proved invaluable. With the property properly registered, they expanded and ran the business wisely. Christopher called his daughter Baby and spent all his free time with her. The girl loved her father and became attached to him with all her heart. For 3 more years, Christopher did not want to hear anything about his mother. Time has softened him a little, and he decided to forgive Julia. But only by changing would she be forgiven. Christopher himself devised a plan of redemption. Linda and Peggy did not immediately accept the offer to teach their mother a lesson. It seemed too cruel a way to bring Julia to her senses. "What? Christopher, we've already suffered for 5 years, just like Linda lost you. Julia didn't even spare our future children," said Peggy. "I never drank her poison. It was impossible to drink that stuff. Sometimes the decoction was switched, and sometimes it poured out," Christopher replied. "What did she use? Wormwood. Let her drink the wormwood herself." It was like this. Christopher had been living in the house of Rosemary, a neighbor. When Julia came to the house, the son was in a room a few feet away from his mother. He was glad she was near, alive and well. But changing her character was more important than meeting her. For the time being, Peggy moved into Christopher's house at the recreation center. Christopher wrote a message, changing his handwriting beyond recognition. He wanted his mother to feel a little of what Linda had experienced. It didn't seem enough for him to just confuse her. He invented a whole epic of redemption, remorse, separation from his granddaughter, the bitterness of loneliness. Rosemary also made the frost and wormwood. The wormwood was laced with sleeping pills and hallucinogenic grapes. It seemed unnecessarily extreme. But Christopher persuaded Rosemary's neighbor that there could be no harm. The drugstore had a remedy for the poisoning, which they put in the drink. Christopher came in at night when his mother drank the wormwood concoction, worried about how she was feeling. But it turned out that the son only aggravated the situation, scaring Julia to death. the story of the repairs, and help stunned Christopher. It was beyond his plans, but it was a good sign. Julia changed beyond recognition, started dating Dylan. The neighbor was against this punishment, but he couldn't change anyone's mind. Only supported Christopher in her troubles. The hardest step for the son was the story with the cemetery, but one day he cheated death himself, as if born again. He looked at everything with different eyes. He wanted his mother to feel the same way. He made a shallow hole, but forgot to put the shovel away. Julia hit her head, luckily not badly. Christopher gave her a shot with sleeping pills and took her to a pre-prepared hole in the cemetery. There was actually a man to be buried there, so the grave was dug hastily. He had made something that looked like a coffin, more like a box with a lid that could be easily removed from the inside. He had even carefully placed a pillow. Later, Christopher was horrified at what he had done, but remembering that Linda had lived in hell for a year and a half and had almost lost her child, he calmed his conscience. He waited anxiously for his mother's return. He knew that she would be picked up by the locals on the road and that her lust for life would take its toll. Julia returned in a sorry state and then went to Kevin, the precinct commander. But Kevin knew Christopher's history and was even friends with him, taking advantage of his legal knowledge on occasion. He called Christopher beforehand and asked what to do. That way Julia didn't find out ahead of time that Christopher was alive. Perhaps the son's decision to leave his mother in the dark was too cruel. For 3 years he held a grudge. The only thing he couldn't forgive was Linda. Peggy and Grandma Rosemary softened his heart. They sympathized with him wholeheartedly. Linda and Rosemary wanted to tell Julia several times that Christopher was alive, but they did not dare to interfere. The long-awaited moment had arrived. Julia arrived at their vacation base and walked into the main building. There was no one in the lobby. An Indian tune was playing. She looked around, saw the television, and was taken aback. Pictures of her granddaughter, mother, daughter-in-law, son were changing one after another. Christopher, she whispered quietly with tears. "Sorry, Mom," came a familiar voice from behind her. Julia turned around, saw Christopher, cried out, and collapsed. She had to call an ambulance. Later, her condition worsened, and Julia was taken to the city clinic. The woman had suffered a stroke. Christopher could not believe what was happening. Instead of a happy reunion and family reunion, he drove his mother to the hospital. Peggy, without a word, packed up and left for her home in Miami. The magical transformation of the dwelling hurt her heart. Everything had already been lovingly arranged. Her daughter Linda had performed a miracle with her own hands. The old mother sat on the new couch, thinking that Julia had recently slept there. "I forgive you, my daughter," she said tearfully. She lay down on the couch and fell asleep. She never woke up again. In the evening, Peggy was visited by Dylan as usual, but it was too late. He broke the sad news to Christopher and Linda. 3 days later, the funeral was held. Half the town was there to say goodbye to Peggy. Christopher and Linda wept uncontrollably. Their daughter Nancy screamed loudly, not understanding why her beloved grandmother was buried in the ground. A week later, Julia was discharged. Still recovering from the blow, she tried to speak, but nothing came out. She could hardly move, mumbled and cried. For the first time, the family lived at Peggy's house. Christopher dropped his mother off, gave her massages, made her exercise, and in the evenings got on his motorcycle and rode off somewhere. He couldn't forgive himself for the anger he harbored toward his mother. Whatever she is, she's still family. He himself is just as bad a person. He himself must walk the path of redemption. His mother's illness and his grandmother's death weighed heavily on Christopher's shoulders. Dylan came to Julia, took her in his arms, put her in the stroller he had bought for her, and they walked together along the river. After 2 months, Julia began to talk and walk on her own. "Dylan, I want to go home," she said. "Where to?" "To the city," Dylan asked. "And son? Granddaughter, are you with me? How can I leave my mother?" "Will you visit?" Julia asked. "We'll get her a helper." Dylan was really attached to Julia. After some thought, he agreed. The next day, while Christopher and Linda were at work, they left for the city. Christopher was informed of the move by Rosemary. She shook her head sternly, and from then on stopped all communication with him. 10 years passed. Young, beautiful Nancy, who was now jokingly called Maria Lovna, graduated from high school, and entered teacher training college. Over time, Julia grew stronger, recovered. In the city, she took a rehabilitation course at the best clinic. She and Dylan moved to the country for the summer. They stayed with Christopher and Linda. Rosemary lived in the city with her son for 5 years. She passed away quietly, with God's blessing, buried next to Peggy. We were neighbors, and we still are. The family council decided that Nancy would now live in town like a queen. They entrusted her with Dylan's ancestral apartment. Julia and Dylan sold the house in the village, gathered up their savings, and traveled. Too many painful memories were here. Christopher and Linda sold Peggy's house, deciding to leave the village. They bought a condo in Miami, hired a manager for their vacation home base, and moved in. They visited their daughter almost every month until she graduated and got a job in her home village as an elementary school teacher. Julia and Dylan came to visit to see their granddaughter. They traveled to every city in the United States and then went abroad. Over time, the vacation home passed to Nancy, who stayed true to the land where she was born. Every summer she came to the cemetery with a basket of peanuts to visit her grandmother. The mom didn't cry, or become hysterical, or numb, or scold the men, or pity her daughter touchingly. She behaved in her usual manner. Sitting down opposite, she reached across the table and stroked Violet's palm. "Violet, it's for the best that you saw his true face," she said. "They're like that nowadays anyway, dumped sooner or later, even in the hardest moments of life. If it hadn't been for Deborah, someone else would have come along. Be glad you won't have to regret the time and effort you wasted. Come on, honey, let's make lemon cookies for ourselves." "Mom, are you kidding me? What cookies? I can't breathe," Violet sobbed. Mom just let her sob, looking on with understanding and concern. She waited patiently for the tears to dry up, and then she brought a glass of water and said, putting her arm around Violet's shoulders, "It really helps a great deal in such cases to do something familiar and ordinary. Of course, except for unpleasant chores like cleaning and washing dishes, I can't stand both. Although I love cooking and can create a culinary miracle from the simplest and cheapest products. I hate to wash dishes and make clean without any caprice," sincerely informed the mother of her fans. And the frightened lovers of free coziness quickly disappeared. Violet didn't work out like Mom. She didn't know how to stand up for herself, so they took everything away from her. So they took Max. That's what she should do. 6 months ago, Violet had a happy accident. She was in the right place at the right time, and her humble life miraculously changed. She had just graduated from teacher's college and came to work in a kindergarten. Many old acquaintances were surprised by Violet's unfashionable choices. She studied well at school, without any special efforts, and could have chosen a more prestigious and profitable specialty. Only her mother, grandmother, and friend Deborah were not surprised. They knew that Violet loved babies, and babies adored her. Since Violet herself had had time to grow out of toddler's your age, hadn't she? And there's no point in resisting the calling. Of course she won't stop at college. She'll combine her major with work. Violet was given a junior group of 15 3-year-olds, 10 of them boys, and half of them hyperactive. It's a roller coaster ride of a shift. Her magical ability to calm children will definitely come in handy here. The 5 tiny girls in Violet's group were amusingly different from each other. 2 princesses, 2 shy, thoughtful. And Tara slid down the roof of the children's slide like a monkey, or twirled around in a pretty dress, or looked at flowers, beetles, and butterflies, trying to remain almost invisible. The little girl herself was neither battered nor intimidated. She was just cozy enough to ponder alone. After watching her teacher for a couple days, Tara decided that she could be trusted, and when she felt like it, she showed her findings or drawings. She loved to draw. Violet couldn't help it. She had grown attached to the little girl and loved her more than anyone else. Her mother usually came to fetch Tara, a small, graceful blonde, a little older than her teacher, gentle, polite, and not verbose. She seemed to be an enlarged copy of her little daughter. She raised the child alone and often looked sad and tired. According to the headmistress, they lived in threes: Tara, her mother, and grandmother. But the grandmother had not yet been seen in the kindergarten. They gossiped in the kindergarten that she was against Tara's birth, persuaded her daughter to have an abortion, and now she did not help in raising the little girl on principle. Violet felt even more sympathy for the girl. She herself had grown up without a father, but she had never doubted the love and care of her mother and grandmother during her childhood. Violet could have grown up distrustful, wary. But her mother's easygoing nature got in the way. Mama was convinced that most people weren't bad. They're just very different, and that's why there's misunderstanding between them. It was Violet's third month at the daycare center. One day, instead of Mama Mia, a sturdy, charming brown-haired man of about 25 came to pick up Tara. He was energetic, tanned, with gray-blue eyes and a bright, self-assured smile. Violet thought he realized the impression he'd made on the young educator, and it was a shame. Had Tara's father remembered her? She thought, but in an instant she realized no, it was not her father, but her mother's brother. And she said out loud, "I can't give my child to a stranger. It's for the safety of the children entrusted to us. Tara's mom didn't tell me someone else was coming for her." No problem, the stranger apologized generously. He pulled out his cell phone, made a call, and said into the receiver, "Mia, here is the most beautiful Mary Poppins me baby does not give me the baby. Talk to her in your own voice that I'm not a stranger." And he put Violet on the phone. "Violet, it's me, Mia. Violet, it's me, Mia. It's Tara's mom's voice. I'm sorry I forgot to warn you yesterday. My brother Max is here, and I asked him to pick up Tara so I wouldn't have to run from work." As tanned Violet knew, Mia's accountant has a strict boss who would rather stay late at work than leave early. Sometimes all the kids are already picked up, and Violet and Tara are still walking alone on the playground, waiting for their mom. It's good that Mia will get some rest, and Tara won't feel bad that she's the last one to be picked up, and for some reason it's very unpleasant that the young man is not Tara's dad. Though that doesn't mean he doesn't have kids of his own. Why should she care about that anyway? "Thank you for your vigilance," said the guy with a mock serious look. "Can you be trusted? Come, uncle, little girl, let's go home." At the exit, he turned around with the girl in his arms. "My name is Uncle Max." "Goodbye," Uncle Max. Violet said goodbye with a restrained smile and forced herself to turn around and walk from the locker room to the group. Don't let him think he impressed her. She sees uncles like that every day. It's so commonplace, and his smile is Hollywood. Like an ad man or a salesman. It's embarrassing. Anyway, it didn't work out for Violet. She kept thinking about Tara's uncle all evening, and the next day he came for her niece again. The usually cautious, reserved Tara ran to him, spreading her arms. "Uncle, pardon me for asking," Violet ventured to ask. "Is everything all right with Mia?" "Everything's fine," Uncle Max assured her. "I just thought I'd relieve my little sister. While I'm here, at least let her live without the daily evening races to the kindergarten. I'm out of contract, so I came to my folks for a vacation. I don't know how it's going to go." He was probably waiting for Violet to ask him something about who he worked for, where he worked. But Violet only nodded and said, "Okay, I see." And then she felt how stupid and boring it sounded. "Oh, I almost forgot." He slapped himself lightly on the forehead and held out a box of expensive candy. "These are for you. Violet and her mom used to get them on holidays." "Thank you." She was surprised. "What are the gifts in honor of?" "In honor of our acquaintance," the boy smiled. The next day he brought 5 large cherry roses. Tara was jumping up and down, happy with her favorite teacher's gift. Violet didn't have time to find the right word. The uncle picked up his niece, promised to come back tomorrow, and walked out the door of the group. Violet, after some thought, took the flowers home and told her mother about her new acquaintance. "Anyway, he's not a cheapskate," Mom laughed lightly, admiring the bouquet. "The flowers are gorgeous. Now, so many men do not give flowers. Even funny to say, they consider women mercantile for the desire to get a bouquet or a cup of coffee in a beautiful coffee shop. They draw stupid conclusions. Yes, I will always support a man in difficult moments, do not reproach. I will share all the hardships, but I do not intend to do it for a known bogeyman. One good thing is that you can see them right away." "Oh, I'm distracted." Mom loved lyrical digressions, as she called them. She didn't share the details of her personal life with Violet, but she was happy to think out loud and you could more or less understand what she was going through. Haley had a happy streak. She was always interested in life, Even if it wasn't going well, it was probably what made her look younger than her years and all of her classmates. Despite her modest income, she didn't hover in the clouds, but just a little soaring above reality. "Do you seem surprised and confused?" she asked Violet. "Why would I be? The usual. A young man has decided to court you in the classic way. That's not a bad thing, as long as he's not married. I don't advise you to get involved with married men." "You're so pretty, Violet. Girls have been guessing that since they were little. You don't seem to have any doubts, do you?" With a modest smile, she added, "Just a piece of antique window dressing." A modest beauty. My mother always managed to make me feel confident that everything would be all right. The next day, Max came to visit again. He took out of the inner pocket of his jacket 2 rectangles of theater tickets. "Let's go to the theater on Saturday," he suggested. "I mean, really, I'm just asking if you'd like to go out with me, Violet." "We could try," Violet said. "It's a really good theater." Saturday night, Deborah popped out, caught Violet packing. "Wow," she said, her eyes widening in amusement. "Are you putting on a case? Did something unusual happen?" "My best friend doesn't know." Haley hummed and disappeared somewhere. Violet was a little confused. Her friend could guess what was going on, even in the middle of nowhere. And here was such physical evidence. Haley sewed at home. She could use ready-made patterns or custom orders, coordinated down to the smallest detail. She could use her own imagination when the customer didn't know what she wanted. Clients were very different. They paid not only in money, but also primitive natural exchange, as Mom called it. The sewing of a strict business suit was partially paid for by a piece of artificial tie silk from one client. Haley hadn't been warned of this turn of events. She was counting on the full amount in cash. She and Violet were just going through another rough patch. That was Haley's expression, too. That's what she called periods of no money. But Violet's times were the same, and she hoped to get out of them by going to the interview in the suit Haley and Pasha had made and getting her dream job. "Will pay, but it'll do." Haley agreed, looking at the narrow piece of smooth, navy-colored fabric. And 2 days later, they sewed Violet an elegant new suit, and her daughter a simple, elegant dress. Coco Chanel had a little black one, Haley announced. And Violet will have a little turquoise one. It suits the brown girl. "Mom, but it's a masterpiece." Violet exhaled sincerely, wrapping herself twice in her new clothes in front of the mirror. "But now I have to think up where to wear it so as not to offend him." "Oh, if there was a dress, there would be occasions," Haley assured her. Deborah had tried to borrow a dress once. She'd counted on it, but it was tailored to Violet's exact measurements. "I'll be sure to sew something to fit your tantalizing thighs," Haley comforted Violet, and the dress waited in her closet. Deborah looked at Violet now and made a quick judgment. "Let's just say you haven't had time to tell me what's new, but now you're just not going to get away with it. Nothing much has happened, or you'd be the first to know." Violet assured me, and it was true. Violet and Deborah had been friends since kindergarten, ever since Deborah's parents had come to town and put her in preschool. No one could explain why such different girls had become such good friends. But they had never even quarreled once. Somehow there was no reason. Deborah's self-love, named after her grandmother, suited her rare name Deborah very well. There was something icy about it. If their school had a casting call for the role of the Snow Queen, Deborah would definitely be chosen. And no one could blame her for anything. She wasn't angry with anyone. She didn't fight with anyone. She didn't gossip about anyone. Deborah wasn't perfect. She just had little interest in other people. For a select few, she made an exception, and among them was her childhood friend Violet. Haley was very pleased with their friendship. In her opinion, the compassionate Violet with her gentle charm was a wonderful influence on her daughter. Violet had been told this with a smile by her own mother. "That's what she said. I'm quoting you. Almost exactly. But I know you're a good person without her." Deborah wasn't so easy to get away from. I had to tell her about Theron. "What an uncle." "To think of it," said Deborah. "I personally talked you out of working at the kindergarten. And do you remember one of the main arguments?" Yes, I do, laughed Violet, pulling her blue suede shoes out of the box. It's boring because you don't meet anyone. It's all moms and grandmas. I'm going to admit I'm wrong, Deborah said. You introduced me to him. You know I'm realistic, and I'll tell you what your Uncle Theron's breathing. He's not mine at all, Violet said. We're not rushing things yet. We've only just met, and we're just going to the theater. Maybe the man left his hometown a long time ago and has no friends left here, no one to go out with. And I thought you'd be interested in my opinion, Deborah said. If I had someone, I'd introduce you right away. And by the way, he could take his sister to the theater. And he's taking you. By the way, what does he do? A petroleum engineer. He used to work in the north, on shifts. Now he doesn't want to work anymore. He's looking for something with a regular schedule and closer to civilization. He's not poor, I guess, Deborah remarked. Tania, are you sure you're not married? Isn't there a Yakut woman waiting for him in a yurt in the far north? I know Yakutia, Violet grinned. It's given to you. Just tell you something. And so it went. In fact, it was fortunate that Deborah came in while Violet was giggling, wondering if she looked good enough. While you're waiting for a meeting, you realize that your fears of appearing boring are useless and silly. And still you think about it like ants running around. When Max called, Violet was long gone. They were sitting in the kitchen, Haley knitting and drinking coffee and chocolate chip cookies. Violet was just waiting and trying to appear casual. I'll be right out, she promised into her cell phone and looked out of the fourth-floor window into the street. Deborah followed. Howdy, she stated. I wonder if it's a credit car. Everything was going great. Classic, as Haley would define it. After a few years of working in the north, Max had planned a 2-month vacation with his family. Then he had plans for Moscow, especially since it wasn't far away. 2 years ago, he had already bought a studio on the outskirts and had been renting it out all this time. Now they would ask the tenants to vacate the apartment for the landlord. He would live and look for a job in Moscow. By the end of the 2nd month in his hometown, Max made one more item in his plans. One Saturday night, he unexpectedly came to visit with a bouquet and a cake. He met my mom and immediately announced, Haley, I have serious intentions. I want to marry Violet. I'll be honest with you. We'll have to wait. I need to find a job in Moscow that will allow me to provide for my family. I'm used to good wages in the north and to civilization. It's harder to find such a salary. If I don't find it yet, I'll go back on shift. I need a bigger apartment for my family instead of a studio. I see an active man, Max, and that's not a bad thing, Haley said. But I'm guessing this is the first time Violet has heard about your plans together. It was the plain truth. Violet was caught off guard, and she wasn't good at pretending. In those 2 months, she had fallen so self-consciously in love that everything else in her life had taken a back seat, seemed unimportant. She felt so good that she was afraid to think of the future, lest she jinx it with her plans. Violet had never been superstitious before, but now she was. She dared to look only very far into the fact that Max was going to Moscow. They would call each other. He would start coming for the weekend, as he had promised. She would wait and rush the weekend. How long it would last, she tried not to think. I wanted to talk to both you and Violet at once, Max said. Violet, will you be my official fiancée? I agree, Violet said. It wasn't how she'd imagined it, but she was still very happy. She wanted to hug Max, but she was shy in front of Haley. He too was sitting there as solemn as a principal at a banquet. I'll bring the ring back from Moscow. There's no good jewelry store here, Max said. I'm sorry this was so awkward. We understand that not everything can be calculated and planned, Haley reassured him. A spontaneous decision isn't always worse than a well-considered one. Was I lucky to have a mother-in-law? Max exclaimed. Your mother-in-law sure is, assured Haley, and I'm all for total non-interference. Yes, Mom, she really is, Violet confirmed. Her voice didn't even sound familiar. It was more melodic today because she was singing inside. Max could have gone to Moscow without this offer. She hadn't expected anything like that from him. It wouldn't even occur to her to take offense at his not promising anything. It turns out that he really cares for her, too. He wants her to know that he's serious on his part and to wait for him. Being a bride makes the waiting somehow different, and it makes it so much easier for her to wait. And the next week, just before Max left, was her birthday. Max had booked a banquet at a cafe for the closest of her family. On Violet's side were Haley and Deborah. The groom came with his mom, his sister, and Tara. "Violet, you weren't ready to meet your future mother-in-law on her birthday, were you?" Deborah whispered to her. "Not really," Violet admitted. "But if that's what Max wants, I don't mind." "It's your birthday," Deborah reminded her. "I don't really keep track of." Violet remained in their arms. It was the first time she'd ever been to a party, even a small one. All her holidays had been celebrated at home and in the nursery. She looked with interest at the decorated table, the beautifully folded napkins. Evelyn, her mom, found an approach to Max's silent mom, and they talked about fabrics. Mom was generally good with all kinds of people, but she liked her privacy best. Mia, Max's sister, looked tired, but she tried to seem cheerful and lively, like a birthday party should be, praising Violet in front of her mom. "She really likes me, and she's so sweet," grateful Violet thought. Deborah wandered from table to bar to chat with the Chinese bartender who had inexplicably been blown into their town by the wind. This bartender, she moved gracefully across the banquet, showing off her beautiful legs. And the bartender should have been grateful. Patrons from the neighboring room began to pull up to the counter, clearly because of the blonde beauty unperturbed. "You and your friend don't look alike at all," Max's mom told Violet as she watched Deborah. "Of course we're not sisters." Violet laughed. She wanted to spend the evening alone with Max, but it's still nice. Tara's interesting. She'll probably spend a few days drawing everything she's memorized. Max gave Violet a new cell phone for her birthday, and 2 days later he left for Moscow. And the usual routine began. Violet tried her best to get away from work, to switch off. She even tried once again to learn from her mother the wisdom of cutting and sewing. "Are you missing me that much?" Haley asked understandingly. "Yeah," Violet said. "I didn't expect it. I thought those feelings were invented for novels to make them more interesting for women to read. I was sure I'd live in peace." "Wow, I'm sure she wasn't with your genes," smiled Haley. "In consolation, I had strong feelings and I don't regret it at all. I'm glad I did." Max came every week at first, then every other weekend. Violet understood that it was hard to spend 12 hours on the road after a work week and then drive back a day later. Sometimes you just need to sleep at home without anyone interfering. On New Year's Eve, Max invited Violet to his place. He'd show her Moscow at the same time. Sometimes you need a change of scenery. Violet was careful to tell her mother. What would she say to that? Violet thought. "Violet, you really are old-fashioned," said Haley. "Do you think I'm going to talk you out of it?" "No, of course not. We're not in Victorian England, and you're not a schoolgirl. You're an independent adult. It's bound to happen at some point. I'm happy for you that it's not too soon and it's not the wrong way around. And love is important. Trust me on this." Violet believed her mom. She was sure, without proof, that her mother understood love. "Who are you going to spend New Year's Eve with?" "Yeah, are you going to Grandma Jordan's?" Once upon a time, the four of them had lived in this small apartment: Grandma, Grandpa, Mom, and Violet. Violet didn't remember Grandpa very well. He had died early, and Grandma had lived with them for a long time. 2 years ago, she had come from the market and told them from the doorstep that she had met an elderly gentleman who had selflessly helped her carry potatoes and other vegetables home. She wouldn't have bought so many if the gentleman hadn't come along. She decided to take advantage of the opportunity, said Grandma. Grandma's acquaintance turned out to be a resident of a neighboring town. He had a house in the private sector, where he lived alone. His children lived and worked in Moscow and rarely came to visit. His wife had died a few years ago. Jordan had come here for a friend's anniversary, and now he promised to visit more often, Grandmother said coquettishly. Violet and her mom laughed and forgot about it the next day. Jordan wasn't kidding. He came to see Grandma, and one day she asked her girls for permission to bring him to visit. "But Jordan and I aren't college students. We can't go out to restaurants." He tries to take me out for tea and cakes. But in our cafeteria at the supermarket will not sit for hours, said Grandma. And we're not interested in the movies. We want to socialize. Of course, Haley and Violet invited Jordan. He turned out to be a nice man. This former physics teacher, a man of rare manhood, he introduced himself, chuckling. He was no longer teaching at the school, but he ran some kind of technical club for children at the local house of culture. It was obvious that he adored his grandmother. He didn't hide it, didn't conceal it. Violet thought it was a little strange at the time, but Haley said she was just young and inexperienced. 6 months later, Grandma and Jordan decided to move in together. Violet and Haley were invited to visit Jordan's house so they could be assured that Grandma would live in decent conditions. The house was really quite nice and even well maintained. Jordan could do everything himself, including the women's housework. I'm putting my grandmother in good hands, Haley said. I'll get to Grandma Jordan's, Haley answered Violet's question. A good friend invited me to the cottage for New Year's Eve too, to be honest. I just wouldn't have gone if you'd stayed home. I'd rather be with you. I'll have a romantic New Year's Eve too. Maybe. So thank you. Daughter. Have fun in Moscow. Violet and her mom laughed together. My mom is a great mom, Violet thought. Deborah is jealous. You can't talk to her mother. You have to choose your words all the time. You can't say inappropriate things. One must always be decent. You have to live by the rules, even the rules your mom doesn't follow. She likes to say, when you're as old as me, you can do whatever you want. A young girl should behave herself. Where does she get these outdated views? Nobody thinks like that anymore, just her. Your mom cares what you think and feel, and mine cares that no one can say anything bad about me. That's how we live. I could understand it if I were to be married to a millionaire or a sultan, Violet said. Sultans are millionaires too. Aha, continued Deborah, who was not easily diverted from her course. So I say, there's no point in looking to public opinion. Nobody thinks about us, and in fact talk for 2 minutes and forget it. Everybody's busy living their own lives. I'm still in the habit of acting the way I used to, although I'm not under any illusions about meeting a millionaire. Casper, the owner of the hardware store in the basement, is probably my ceiling. Violet didn't hide from Deborah that she sympathized with poor Casper. He'd been a devoted admirer of her friend for almost 4 years, ever since he'd seen Deborah in a long dress at the prom she'd gone to with Violet. But while to someone like Violet's grandmother, Casper was a decent, serious guy, and even a successful businessman, to Deborah he was plain, boring, and rude. But he didn't realize it, because although she argued with her mother, she behaved properly and didn't speak frankly. Violet went to Moscow for New Year's Eve, and she had never had a happier New Year. Not even in her childhood, when Max had shown her the capital on New Year's Day, and in the evening they had returned to his little studio and been alone. I haven't made any friends here yet. I only work, Max said. On weekends I either go to Violet's hometown or just relax and watch TV series if I'm too tired. Violet would wake up in the middle of the night and look over at him. They'll definitely have friends in Moscow when they start living together. They will make a very cozy life. It will be nice to visit them, she thought. Violet helped pick out presents for Max's mother and sister and for Tara, and she was also supposed to drive them. She was a little surprised that Max didn't want to go to his family's house by himself. We could spend half the vacation in Moscow and half at home, Violet suggested. Violet, I'm right here at home. What's there to do there? Where would you and I meet like this? I don't think we'd get to spend so many nights together, Max replied. My mom and I aren't really close. If you've noticed, I love her, of course, but we don't have much to talk about. Mia likes to whine. She gave birth to Theru. No one forced her to, and now it's like it's someone else's fault that she's having a hard time. Of course, I feel sorry for her, but feeling sorry makes you tired. You're just tired. Violet hastened to justify him. She would find something to say to his mother and Mia. She would think of something to make them feel good. Everyone gets tired sometimes, even those closest to them. True, Violet couldn't remember her and her grandmother or her mother ever getting so tired of each other. But men must be different. Sometimes you have to leave them alone so they have time to miss you. She knows too little about that yet. I wonder how Mom is doing when she wished them a happy new year. Her voice was carefree and happy. Tanya sometimes thought Mom was the same age as her Violet thought. The New Year's Eve festivities were over. The usual dark Southern routine was back. The calendar hinted at spring, but they didn't believe in it. Max visited Violet and his family less often, in 2 weeks or even 3. Violet understood, or seemed to understand. But she was restless, anxious. Nights of wind, knocking on the windows, and insomnia. It seemed to Violet that it was bad news knocking at the house that was kept from her during the day. Weekends without Max seemed long and useless. Deborah had somehow become a little distant. She had her own things to do. She had even stopped asking for details. Slowly, Violet became friends with Mia, Max's sister. The soft-spoken Mia came to visit with her daughter, Tara. They drank strong tea with a spoonful of homemade herbal balm, a gift from Jordan's grandmother, and Mom would read a book to Tara or play with her. It was a little funny and very unusual for someone to address Mommy as Baba Haley, but it didn't make Mommy sad at all. Baba is a child's confidence level. Stupid girls. The girls weren't so stupid. They understood. Violet was pleased that Mia and Tara were visiting them often. It was like Max was getting so much closer, and Max would say every time they called, "Thank you for taking care of my girls." Violet's mom always encouraged them to pop in and out more often, and Max's mom was slow to invite them over. She's such a person. Violet's own mom would reassure Violet. And by the way, it was for the best. She's probably not interested, and she doesn't need to know everything about you, to watch you, to control you, to find things out. It'll be easier for you if you ever get married. Mama said it in good faith, without innuendo or double meaning. But Violet still didn't like it. If and someday. Is anything else ambiguous, she thought. After their promises and arrangements and all the wonderful things between them, it was springtime, when it was still cold in the morning without gloves, but the parks were already filled with pale green smoke from buds barely bursting on the trees. Violet had been sent to New York for a scholarly conference for child care providers and educators. Perhaps some of the family child care providers would have liked a change of scenery and a trip to New York. But the head sent a free Violet, who sympathized with her, very much a young and responsible specialist, for all the time of work without conflicts with the parents of pupils. In addition, just and fiancée in New York, to see each other. Violet decided to go without calling as a surprise. They hadn't seen each other in over 2 weeks. A surprise visit would make her even happier. "Mia, please don't tell your brother I'm coming. I want to show up out of the blue, surprise him." Mia was silent, a little hesitant, and then asked, "Are you sure, Violet? Wouldn't it be better if we warned him? Do you think your brother would be angry if he saw me? He's the one who keeps saying he misses me. I don't ask him to." "Yes, you're right, don't mind him. Yes, you're right. As my mom likes to say, I'm just very attentive." The conference started on Monday, and Violet arrived in New York on Sunday night. It's a long way from the subway to Max's house. What about a cab? She had so many homemade pies and pickles with her, and she wanted to take a little breather from the road and look pretty for Max. Violet paid the driver and got out of the cab at the corner of the house. There were roadworks, patches on the asphalt, and she had to walk a little. At Max's front door, a couple was saying goodbye. A girl in a light, unseasonable mini dress and a half coat thrown over her shoulders. She had shoulder-length, pearlescent white, thick hair. She tiptoed and kissed the lips of a young man who lightly put his arm around her waist. The girl broke the kiss, but continued to stare at her companion. It was Max, slightly wrinkled and pleased with himself. "Should I say hello to you in your chicken net?" Violet heard a familiar voice, playfully melodic, almost flawless. What is she doing here? Deborah laughed softly, turned away from Max and faced Violet. "One goes away and another comes," she said, not confused. But she didn't wait for an answer. Deborah walked away at what Violet and her mother called an underground pace. She had known her friend too long and too well. She was convinced that Violet would not follow her, would not be able to move. Violet's travel bags froze in her hands. She had to at least put them on the pavement to shake them off, but her fingers wouldn't bend, wouldn't obey. Max, as if nothing had happened, took hold of the handles of the bags and pulled them towards himself. "Give them to me, and let's go home." Violet followed him obediently, as if in a fog. In the elevator, she stood looking at her feet or in the corner. She couldn't raise her eyes to Max, as if she were afraid of seeing someone else entirely. In the apartment, she sat down on the edge of a chair by the table, with her back to the disassembled sofa. "Bunny, I didn't realize you were such a child as your charges in the younger group," Max addressed her condescendingly. "It's not like you and I are pure physiology at all. We rarely see each other. I'm a healthy man, and I have needs. I was sure you understood that, and wouldn't come unannounced so as not to embarrass me and yourself. I would never have let you run into each other here if I had known." "I am not afraid of your coming unannounced at any time," Violet replied. "That's why I'm marrying you. You have all the qualities of a good husband. That pseudo-friend of yours is the kind of woman you'd love to spend time with. Only idiots marry them. But you're not an idiot. You want a homemaker who's easy to fool. You're not that kind of girl. You just want to establish yourself at the expense of others. At least make snide comments about those who are more fortunate. And you fell for it like a little girl. Yes, she gets leftovers, and she convinces herself that she's beaten someone." Violet listened to him, daring him to look up. He didn't think he was wrong. He saw himself as a gift, a prize to be fought over. I guess it was good to be like that as long as there were fools like Violet. She stood up and picked up a smaller bag from the floor. "There's your other one, with the pies and the winter cooking. It's for a present." Max, with a conciliatory smile, blocked her path by the front door. "Don't be silly, Violet. Where are you going for the night?" "A hotel. I have a government room booked." "I'm here for a conference, not to catch you red-handed." "Oh, we're so strict, we're practicing the abused wife. Let me through." "Yes, go ahead, of course. What am I, a beast? When you stop, call me. Where are you staying and when will you be free? We'll go out after my work and your conference." He had a friendly smile. It was funny. He didn't even think to hide it, or even pretend to be remorseful. Violet didn't even have tears. It was like a stone had been placed on her chest. She decided not to call her mom. She wouldn't do anything to help, but she'd only get upset, think more silently, and open orders more slowly. At 7 p.m. The next day, when Violet had just gotten back to her room, Max called. Violet had agreed with herself yesterday that she would not answer the phone, but she broke her promise to herself. Different things happen. People change, realize something in one night, Max said, naming the address where to pick you up. He didn't doubt it at all. She realized that she'd overreacted. People don't change, you just get to know them better over time. But maybe he was only pretending to be so cynical. If he didn't care about Violet, he wouldn't have called. Now he'd take the opportunity to get rid of his annoying girlfriend? Why all the emails and cards, the calls, the gifts, the introductions to families? I mean, he loved her. She couldn't be wrong. She wasn't some gorgeous, unapproachable socialite to conquer her just out of ego. So she does love her. She just didn't know how to express it the way she wanted to. Max arrived quickly, brought a bouquet of white lilies, suggested going to the premiere of the comedy. He was the same as he'd always been before, joking confidently, opening the door in a friendly manner. Violet wondered if he was pretending, or if he really didn't see that she was frozen or petrified. Now he was laughing quietly at the movie, enjoying the evening. Violet didn't care much about what was happening on the screen or around her. "Shall we go home?" he suggested after the movie. "Let's order delivery for dinner, a bottle of wine." Violet was silent. She remembered Nancy, the front door, the bed. "I can't go there yet. You know it hurts. And you're not even apologizing. It's as simple as that. Just because I love you doesn't mean you can do this to me." "Here we go." Max tossed back gloomily. It was all good, after all. And again, these rural pretensions. "It's really your element. Kindergarten, you guessed the profession," said Max. He turned and walked slowly back to the car. Violet barely restrained herself from rushing after him. She was afraid. Even his back showed that he might be gone for good, and she couldn't do anything about it. She can't hold him back, make him regret what he's done and apologize. She can't do anything, she's inept. Deborah was right. The third day of the conference was over. Violet was going home. Max never called. It was a good thing Mia's mom didn't call her, not to alarm her, but texted her on Messenger. It was easier to reply there that everything was fine. You can't hear the voice in the text. Before the train, Violet stopped to buy a small gift for Tara and went to the station. Only settled on a side shelf, slowly floated past the platform. The bell rang. Max ran into the vestibule, tripping over other people's legs stretched out into the passage, as if he couldn't answer it in the car. I thought it would be better to talk to you directly, so that there would be no misunderstandings, so that you wouldn't make up unnecessary things for yourself. Max's voice sounded soft and almost indifferent. For some reason, Violet remembered the Methodist at the conference, tired from the speech and the buffet. You and I shouldn't be in a relationship. I was wrong, I admit it. We're not right for each other. You're over-dramatizing life. You can get tired of it quickly. We'd both get bored. If I'm feeling it now, you know there's no point. You can keep the presents. Be happy. Say hello to mine. I'll stop by sometime. He said that, and then he dropped the call. That's what it's called, dropping it. That's Mom's calm, sad expression, Violet thought. I know Mom well. You knew this was going to happen, and you never said anything to me once. I'm like an old crow that just crows. I didn't like Max too much, but my opinion is my opinion. I'm entitled to be wrong, and I'm not rarely wrong. And why would I want to ruin the best moments of your life? Said Mia. It was good, wasn't it? Violet exhaled. Well, then, everything's fine. There's nothing to regret. It was, and it will be. Not with him. Do all men look at it that way? Why do I even want to be in a relationship? Come on, don't generalize, Mia said. They're just as different as we are. What loyalty isn't everyone's cup of tea. It's true. Things happen in life. I do not judge anyone for a long time, but a kind, decent person behaves differently. If his girlfriend, especially his fiancée, catches him with someone else. Of course, when he loves her. Perhaps even if he doesn't love her anymore, it's still different. And you realize that. Sometimes a guy's an incorrigible red tape, but he's a good man. And in Max's case, it's not the cheating that matters. It's how he behaved afterwards. You got rid of a piece of shit daughter. Well, that's something to celebrate, isn't it? You've lost track of her friends, Mom Violet sighed. We haven't even had a single fight. Seriously. Ever since we were kids, we've all trusted each other. And now, even if I wanted to, I couldn't trust her in the smallest things. It's not an accident. She came to LA to see him. It's deliberate. Stella won't want to be in a relationship with me after her brother and I broke up. She's not a friend. Deborah wasn't a friend. She was just a hitchhiker. People like that are friends when it suits them. Not when it doesn't, they'll take a boot to the head and move on. No one to regret either. Stella is not a stupid girl, though her mother and brother think otherwise. She'll figure out who she wants to hang out with. If she distances herself from you, it's because she's embarrassed about her brother. It happens to people with a conscience. Someone else did something nasty, shame on you. When you went to work, Mom, could you just jump from one topic to another? Violet was used to it, but sometimes she couldn't keep up with her mother's thinking. Monday. Today is my day off, and tomorrow is a work day. After the conference, let's go out of town for the weekend, and if I'm lucky, I won't even be sad. A friend with whom I met New Year's Eve has a dacha in a magical place, almost in the middle of the forest. There are snowdrops in the sunny meadows. Mom, you've never introduced me to your friends, Violet said. Is it something serious? Just a man with whom I will gladly introduce you. His name is Leslie, that is on passport Alexei. And serious, not serious, a little bit of everything. In any case, I'm welcome to visit with my daughter, or with my mom, or with Jordan, in addition. There's a dog and 2 ginger cats. Oranges, tangerines. Let's go. It was Max's first vacation. He was so lucky he was going on vacation alone, without his wife. His wife, having received an invitation to the wedding of a girlfriend in Los Angeles, was excited. She packed up and flew off. She picked up speed from the very doorstep and didn't even offer her husband company for the sake of decency. "You should have asked me," Max said. And I shook my head. "There will be ours, our yoga class. You're not interested. And I deserve a vacation and total relaxation. And I want to see a real California wedding, a California mother-in-law and all the other highlights. And you can make up for it by going somewhere else." "Does Dad know you need a vacation?" asked the wife, and flew away happy and satisfied. It was even annoying that he's not jealous anymore. Letting her go on vacation alone, just to have fun without her husband. And after all, not so long lived together. Max married the daughter of the technical director of not the smallest company, in which he worked as a development engineer. They met at a summer corporate retreat, where employees could take one of their family members with them at will. There was a lot of people. Contests, fireworks, dancing to pops, all sorts of nonsense for the fun of office workers. But a bright, confident brunette approached him when he was bored at the bar on the open veranda. "What kind of cocktail would I like?" she asked. She wasn't exactly Max's type, but if she was showing interest, it was indecent to ignore the chance. Max ordered more cocktails, drinking potentially. "I'm going out for a quick minute," Roxy said after the dance. "Stay here, don't leave." "While your lady goes to powder her nose, I'll tell you something," came the mocking voice of Peter's colleague over my shoulder, "so that you do not particularly scatter. That's our Sam's daughter, the one and only favorite. She doesn't want to work. She'll get it here, she'll die there. It's not my thing. She'll go and live in Florida, Hawaii, and then go back to learning new things. Daddy's a retrograde, and he wants to marry her off. She's going to be 30 soon. To him, that's the age for girls to worry about being single. I mean, it's not the best butterfly for your herbarium." Max managed to say a big thank you to Peter, only mentally. He grinned and disappeared into the crowd of colleagues, barely noticing that his companion was returning. If Max had any interest in Roxy, it had diminished with the news of her parentage. Better to play the right nerd, so that Roxy would get bored and switch to a more interesting subject. Violet could be seen to be a gambler. Max's game of nerdiness turned out well, even talented in some places. There was a reason he was in good standing with the company. But that damn Roxy liked him too. She preferred to think of herself as a romantic, but in fact she was determined, strong-willed, and tenacious. Max, who liked to set the tone in relationships and talk up girls, felt driven for the first time. Roxy had asked for his phone number after the corporate party, and she'd called him herself, never doubting that he'd welcome the call. She could call in the middle of the day and talk passionately about all the nonsense that girls usually had girlfriends for. When he was silent for a long time, patiently listening to this nonsense, she interrupted herself and asked, "Or are you not interested?" I didn't want to check what would happen if he answered not very much. All the more so because another alarm bell was ringing. Francis began to tell Max. He'd treated you well before as a promising, responsible employee. But in a human way, he looked at you the same way he looked at others. He didn't notice you much before the corporate party, but after the summer corporate party, he started to touch on non-work topics. We talked about cars and boats. Max was invited to a fishing trip in a narrow circle, in which revolved rather closed, serious Sam. There was a lot to think about. He seemed to be seen as a future son-in-law. His relationship with Roxy was a protracted candy bouquet. Max just didn't want to complicate his life for fear of repercussions. In the eyes of Roxy's parents, he clearly looked like a well-mannered, serious young man with moral fiber who needed more than just a bed. It would have been very funny if it wasn't happening to him. A week before fishing, Max raided several thematic sites and bought himself the right equipment and the right spinning, with which it is not ashamed to appear in a serious fishing community. He enjoyed fishing as a hobby, looking for the upside to his position, and this was the first thing that came to mind. In fact, he just wasn't planning on getting married just yet. He was quite happy with the advantages of a single life. But if he reconsidered his plans, everything was going very well. The second such chance for a guy from a small town in the most ordinary family may not be. Without the right acquaintances and favorable kinship, he expected only routine work and slow career growth. That is, if in the office with business trips, without a shift, and he didn't want a shift anymore. Max liked comfort. To be honest with himself, the prospect of marrying Roxy suited him just fine. Say the daughter of the head of the security department, gray, with a heavy chin, and the look of a school vice principal would be a really dull option. Roxy is bright, draws male attention to herself, and overall she's a good-natured, cheerful girl, if you don't look at the little things. Max was well aware of what confused him the most. He couldn't stand feminists and seriously believed that most women's woes are from their influence. Max makes the money and dictates the rules. He envisioned his wife as a pretty, gentle girl who owed him a lot and recognized his supremacy. He had once had one almost 3 years ago in his hometown. It seems it was in another life. Violet's kindergarten teacher is a cozy, naive girl. He actually almost married her. Thought she was just the right fit. If I'd gotten my hands on her friend who entertained for money. The hunter's appetite kicked in and my girl was in the wrong place at the wrong time and saw us, and walked around with such a reproach in her eyes and seriously waiting for repentance. Although before she had obeyed without question, Max recalled. He saw the snake lurking in a quiet pool and changed his mind about getting married. Max achieved everything himself, not to have his standards imposed on him, and now here we are. He's definitely not going to live by his own rules. Max still hadn't decided overnight from Friday to Saturday what line of behavior to take at the informal meeting. Francis, his 2 friends, and his cousin greeted Max cordially and did not show their superiority. Late in the evening, as the company drank and dined in a cozy rented cottage, Sam called Max to the terrace and bluntly asked, "Are you serious with Roxy? Just explain honestly, man to man, I'll understand." "I love your daughter, Sam," Max declared. "Whatever happens." "Why are you stalling?" "She's waiting. It's just a fashion for girls to be independent. But they're really waiting for a man to take the initiative. You know that without me, you're not a boy anymore." "I realize that I am not yet able to provide her with the standard of living to which she is accustomed," Max justified himself. "I'm afraid I'm not up to it. I don't want to look like a cunning provincial Alfonso. It's not for me. I realize that Roxy deserves someone more successful." "So what?" "We're so proud," Sam snorted. "Okay, I hear you. I get it. Now I'll tell you, my daughter has my personality. We don't care that you're not rich. It'll all come. You just have to want it." "Do you have it?" "I can see that, and I'll help you," Sam said. "I care about my daughter's happiness, not what other people think. I don't work like an ox for myself. When you have kids of your own, you'll understand. Roxy never wanted to get married. She just waved it off. But she wants to marry you. So don't hesitate, and don't hesitate to propose. Your mother and I will throw you any kind of wedding you want. 300 people, or just the 2 of us in the Maldives." "Thank you for your understanding, Sam. Just as long as everything works out," Max replied. And that's how Max got married. Olivia didn't want a big celebration. "Weddings are just for drunken guests and hackneyed plots," she said. Max was grateful to her. First, he was bored with crowded gatherings. Secondly, he realized that his mother and Mia would look unrepresentable against the background of well-groomed, carefree friends and peers of the bride. Poor, simple-minded relatives of a provincial boy. And without a lavish wedding, there is no show of one's humble kin. Max called home and announced that he was getting married. They will go on a wedding trip, and then sometime come to visit with gifts. Since then, Max never got around to stopping by, not even by himself. Mom came to visit a couple of times at their new apartment. She liked her daughter-in-law sociable, friendly, energetic. Son listens to her, and he is very much in favor of control. You can see that, Mom said to Max. He even listened calmly, did not object. His wife was really a good influence on him. Sister Mia never came once. Olivia gave her sister the usual greetings. "When I call home, tell her I hope to see her and get to know her better," she told Max. Olivia was easy to get along with, as long as she didn't contradict her. She turned out to be smart, observant. Max had to say goodbye to all his girlfriends and not make any new ones. Max's day was scheduled by the minute, so it would be extremely difficult for him to carve out time for anything but Olivia's work and her approved hobbies like fishing with her dad. By the way, Max had really gotten into fishing. Sam was a tough strategist and tactician at work. In life, however, he was a simple, honest uncle who didn't go into complicated reasoning and sincerely attached to his son-in-law. Now he wanted grandchildren, and he told Max about it as directly as he offered his daughter as a wife. "Max, when do you plan to have children?" "I'm old enough." "She wants to." She was talking to her mother, and I overheard. "You know we're going to help you with everything. Olivia's going to be a great mom, a caring mom. It's the most suitable thing for her to do." Maxim himself would prefer that Olivia's activity, care, and custody be transferred to a child, or better two. They had tried to have children, but so far it had not worked out. Olivia was not upset. Since childhood, she was sure that sooner or later everything she aspired to would come true. If she wanted to have a child, she would have a child. And so the wife flew to Spain for the wedding, and Max flew to Cyprus. During the day, we'll go to the Mediterranean fishing from the yacht, in the evenings to remember his youth. His wife's parents did not approve of the daughter's decision to go to the wedding alone, so put up with a solitary vacation son-in-law. Not to offend the guy finally. Of course, young people live differently than we did. But it's still wrong to vacation separately, Sam thought. No, it's one thing to go fishing without women in a purely male group somewhere in the middle of nowhere. It was quite another to get married and go to an adventurous resort. Just in case, Max hinted to Sam that he would go fishing, find a group of vacationers, fishermen, or at least one like-minded man. That's how he'd spend the whole vacation. Sam even believed him, but Haley pressed her lips together reproachfully and kept silent, reminding Max of a more glamorous, stately version of his own mother. No one accompanied Max to the airport. Haley had expressed a desire to go, but she'd overslept and decided not to go. She wouldn't have time to pack. Maybe she wanted to see if the young, long-legged secretary was flying with her son-in-law. But the desire to sleep overcame her vigilance. At the airport, Max looked for his flight on the electronic board. He stumbled, stepping on something hard, and almost twisted his foot. He cursed quietly, looked under his feet, and saw a child's wooden cube with letters on it, almost like the ones he had as a child. This one rolled the farthest away. A little farther away, a thin girl was collecting the rest of the cubes in a box. Max hadn't remembered her in 1,000 years, but he recognized her at once. Violet. Wow, she hadn't changed at all. Still busy with the same children's toys. That's to be expected. Violet froze, looking around for someone. She didn't see Max. He took advantage of it. He jumped up behind her, quietly handed her the unfortunate cube from behind her shoulder, and suddenly asked in a stern inspector's voice, "What's Violet Henry doing at the airport on a weekday?" "Accompanying kindergartners on a field trip to flight attendants and stewardesses." I didn't expect to remember her middle name. Violet flinched slightly, barely perceptible, and turned around. For a few seconds there was a flicker of confusion in her eyes, but it was immediately replaced by a calm smile, the kind of smile one uses when greeting someone one knows on a first-name basis. "Violet Henry sometimes rests," she grinned softly, indifferently, ignoring Max's tactless prank. I wanted to continue the conversation and embarrass her. But Violet saw the people she'd been waiting for. A little girl with a mop of brown curls and bright red sneakers was running toward her. She was followed by a cheerful girl and a schoolboy. "Mom, it's okay. We washed them all." Violet heard the little girl's cheerful report. "Good girl." Violet laughed. "Here are the cubes. Tell Misha to put them in his backpack, and don't look in other people's backpacks." "I used to play customs with Misha," said the little girl. She looked a lot like Violet. The same thick hair, the same clear skin with a few freckles. The eyes are not light brown, autumnal, not visible, but almost round, big and mischievous. You can already see that she will grow up to be very beautiful, Max suddenly thought. "Thank you, Tara, for bringing order to this gang," Violet said to her friend. "I met an old acquaintance while I was waiting for you." She nodded politely to Max. "We should go. Have a good day. Have a good vacation or business trip." "And to you, girls," nodded Max. The friends separated the children, taking each of them by the hand. They went to the baggage claim line. Somewhere in the middle of the line for the Montenegrin flight, an elderly woman with suitcases was waiting for them. I wonder if he was just choosing between Cyprus and Montenegro, but he chose Cyprus. It would have been funny if they had flown to the same resort town, but we didn't, and probably with children choose other resorts, thought Max. As Peter likes to say, when you have children of your own, you'll understand. Somewhere the carefree and waltzing mood disappeared. Max handed in his suitcase, sat at the bar with a brandy and coffee. It seemed that at the opposite end of the hall still flashed this four moms with children, thin girls of about 5 years. How much he understood about children. They'd said goodbye just about 6 years ago. He could very well be her father. And his eyes. He's wrong, though. There's not many eyes like that. And if the child was his, he would have been informed. Sister Mia, who'd never forgiven him for dumping her girlfriend and not even wanting to meet his wife. Or Violet herself. But as it happens, usually let's make up, my love. We'll have a baby or her mom, or his mom, at least as a warning that they can file for child support. No one's ever said a word. It doesn't work that way. So there's probably another option here. Violet was looking for comfort after they broke up, and now someone's seriously comforting. That's fine. It's better to think that way. Anyway, she's not poor now, taking the baby to the seaside. When they met, she had never been further than Moscow. Max had absolutely no intention of thinking about Violet any further. He tried to play a game to guess which of the spicy girls in his line of sight was flying to the same place as him. But the fortune teller wasn't distracting him, and there were no really interesting girls in sight, so he kept looking for the familiar silhouette. She had changed, after all. No, she didn't look older. Still the same as a freshman girl. Light, graceful, calm. There was a confidence about her, something else elusive that made her stand out. Yes, she'd always had good taste, but she didn't get to refine it very often anymore. And that wasn't likely to change. She should at least be able to enjoy her vacation. Olivia called from Spain several times a day, counting nighttime in case she had a nightmare or wanted to share her impressions immediately. To start an affair in such an environment, when at any time may come, seeing his wife's call, only to fray his nerves whether in Cyprus or Massachusetts. Max suddenly realized that he was really tired, and if he wasn't hanging out in a bar or on the beach, he was fishing. In the company of a quiet Yaroslavl uncle of advanced age. Uncle Sam. Max was even a little scared. That he likes such a vacation. Is he getting old? It seems very early for that. He returned to Moscow with fishing bikes for Peter, and the usual life continued. The next year, Olivia drove him crazy with her mood swings. They couldn't conceive. It got to the point where she decided to see a doctor. She hated going to the doctor, except for the dentist, and presented it as a sacrifice for beauty. Going to the gynecologist was even harder for her. Max waited doomedly for her to share the details, as was her habit, but he exhaled with relief. Olivia had suddenly stopped sharing, talking only to her mother. While she waited for the results of the tests, he remembered to give her the usual signs of attention and didn't ask her anything, as long as she left him alone. But one day she came, not looking like herself, fell back in the chair and said with a tremor in her voice, "I don't stand a chance." That's when Max rushed to comfort her, just as she had expected. He did feel a little sorry for her. She's not a bad girl. It wasn't fair that she was so unlucky. He said that doctors sometimes make mistakes, that they still hope and try. You know, all the things you're supposed to do in a case like this. He himself was not depressed. He had no burning desire to have children. To be honest, he didn't see the tragedy of life without them. The only fat disadvantage he saw was that without children, Olivia would have to guard and control him. In another year, Olivia, having consulted with her mom and dad, voiced to Max the decision they would adopt a child. More precisely, they would adopt a child. She wanted a girl. Max was used to show firmness, but from the fright remembered the past and answered categorically and adamantly. "No, don't even try to approach me with this proposal again. You have grown like a greenhouse flower. You don't know life. You have no idea what genes these rejects have. I don't have much faith in parenting when there's been 7 generations of marginalized people. No matter what you do, the genes will show up. No, and that's it." He was sure Olivia wouldn't leave him because of that. She loves him too much, and she'll whine from time to time. but he'd put up with that. He thought his marriage was pretty good, generally better than most. And in the deep autumn, a vaguely familiar melodic female voice called out to him in the mall. Max turned around. He didn't remember it once, but he did. A perky girl with a rare name, Deborah, who had once wanted to wrestle him away from his friend Violet. She'd really grown up. Pretty classy, respectable. Looks like she's doing pretty well for herself. "Hello, Deborah. You look good," Max said. "Oh, come on, it's just a courtesy. I'm waiting for my girlfriend. I've already been through all the galleries twice. If you're not in a hurry, let's have coffee." "Why not? Let's do it." They sat down in the cafe. He only had coffee. Deborah had a cognac too. "I'm fine. I don't drive. I'm not good at it. I'm not good at it. There are people like that. My husband drives me. It has its advantages," she said. "It's convenient. Yes, you live in New York." "Yeah, we moved here 5 years ago." "It's good. Violet lives here too, by the way. Your ex-fiancée and my ex-girlfriend. I know that from my mom. I shouldn't have attacked you the other day. I just lost a good friend. But I'm okay with that. It's been a long time. Do you have a wife, kids, or are you a love tramp?" "Casanova. Wife, no kids. Not that I know of, anyway." "He means you don't know much," said Deborah, without a trace of schadenfreude. "You really don't know, or you just don't want to know." Max had already guessed what she was going to tell him. "Here are ears from you. Nancy's daughter has already started school. You'd have to be a principled daughter like Violet not to demand child support." "I don't think that's my kid. I'd have my mother or sister tell me." "Mother probably would if someone told her. Mia probably knows. But my friend told me not to say anything." "When did you and Violet break up?" "She moved to New York a couple months later, got a job at a private daycare center. Some friend of her mom's, Aunt Haley, helped her out, and then she married him. Imagine that. And my mom has a friend. At our women's health clinic, she's the one who told me that Violet came to see them, and that Violet was pregnant. It's definitely your baby. When it comes to Violet, you can be sure." "So Violet, Aunt Haley, they didn't say anything to anyone. It was just a quick getaway to New York. Violet left. She was born here, and she's still here. I don't know her address. I don't know her phone number. I don't know her address. I don't know her phone number. Bullet. Why are you telling me this now?" "I don't know. Someone should have told you. You decide whether you need this information or not." Deborah laughed quietly. Another 6 months passed and spring came. Roxy had lost weight from worry. Max had always thought thin women looked more attractive, but his wife didn't like thinness. She even forgot his categorical statement about adoption and kept asking, demanding, crying. But one day she met him from work, soft, calm, and thoughtful. After dinner, she made them both a cocktail, sank quietly into a chair, and said, "You already have a child, so you don't want someone else's. You don't even ask where I went for 2 days. You're not interested. I went to your sister's. I've been wanting to meet her for a while, and I thought, why not now? They're both great, your sister and your niece. I got it out of Mia that you had a kid. You know how hard it is to get rid of me." No, I'm not going to get hysterical. That was long before my time. On the contrary, I have a good thing to offer you. Don't laugh. I've given it a lot of thought, and it's a good thing. Why don't you meet my daughter? She'll come to visit us on weekends. We'll give her presents, support her financially. Just be friends. We'll have a kid in the house, and it won't be someone else's kid. I know there are cases like this. It's not uncommon for a girl to be friends with her stepmother. She's so pretty, your daughter. Mia showed me a picture of her, and she's very bright, like Mia says. She picks things up on the fly. Her mom's going to be so happy that they suddenly have support. Olivia, I found out 6 months ago by accident that I had a daughter. You may not believe it, but it's true. If her mom wanted my support, she wouldn't have kept me in the dark for so many years. She's a different kind of person. A little weird, Olivia said. Mia told me how you two broke up. She tried to keep the facts straight. I guess she felt sorry for me. It's not for me to judge you. I had 2 abortions when I was young. And now I'm childless. So it's not for me to moralize. If you're uncomfortable talking to your daughter's mom, I'll talk to her. Maybe it's better that way. I'll explain everything honestly. She'll understand. I'll be like Mia's aunt to Nancy. Olivia always thought you were a practical, sensible woman. At least a reasonable one. Where do you get these crazy ideas? Well, find yourself a hobby. Life doesn't end with kids. That's ridiculous. If you worked like me, you wouldn't have time to think about nonsense. Aunts and uncles. Did you ever think how stupid I'd feel in this situation? She seemed to be thinking about saying something else. You could tell, but she didn't say anything. But it's also wonderful that she's learned to stop, if only for a while. Violet and Nancy were returning from a ballroom dancing class. They walked at a leisurely pace. Nancy talked excitedly about her news, demonstrating the new moves she had been working on today. It was very hard for her to stop right away. After class, the instructor remarked on her flexibility and plasticity. The day was warm today. The sun was already warming, not just shining. On the playground outside their house, away from the double strollers with grandmothers, a strange woman sat on a bench. When she saw them, she stood up and walked toward them. A well-groomed brunette with a beautiful, tired face. Not a single wrinkle. But you could see that she was a grown woman. Not a student, but definitely not one of the moms or other relatives of the children from this kindergarten. "Hello, you're Violet and Nancy," she asked, friendly but a little tense. "Yes, my name is Violet." "This is my daughter," Violet replied in her tone, but a little wary. "This didn't seem like an official visit," said the stranger. "Violet, would you have a moment alone?" "We can do it here, Nancy. Walk a little on the grounds, please, and chat with our neighbors. I won't be long." "All right," replied the girl, glancing curiously in the direction of the stranger. "I'll be around if you need me." The brunette smiled, escorting her with an attentive gaze, and hastily introduced herself. "My name is Olivia, and I'm Max's wife, Nancy's father." There was a brief, careful silence between them. Violet gently broke it first. "Okay, let's get acquainted. I won't even try to hide my bewilderment. Why do you need us? If we haven't threatened your family's budget so far, we won't. I realized that a long time ago. I didn't come to you for that reason at all. I wanted to ask you to let Nancy meet her father. Max has become so shy over the years that he needs a mediator." Violet laughed softly. If he suddenly wanted to communicate with his daughter, having learned of her existence, he would come himself. Especially since you're not happy to mediate in such a matter. I can see he hasn't changed. He's as indifferent to the woman as he ever was. "I'm sorry, Olivia, no offense. Just the facts." Violet felt a strange sympathy for her new acquaintance. There was no hostility from Max's wife, no sense of superiority. She did not scrutinize Violet, did not evaluate her, did not compare her to herself. She just stared expectantly, thoughtfully choosing her words. "Violet, this is going to sound strange, but I'd love to have my husband's daughter in our home. I don't have children of my own. He doesn't want to foster one." Olivia was silent, pausing again to pick her words. "I think I understand. You don't need to explain further." Violet stopped her. "I'll tell you a platitude: doctors sometimes make mistakes. I work in a kindergarten. I know many such stories. Every daycare center has a child whose mother thought she was infertile. Are you hoping for a chance? It helps a lot. What about Nancy? I'm getting married in a month, and for Nancy, my husband-to-be, is her daddy. She doesn't even doubt it. She doesn't even doubt it. Me too, by the way," Violet continued. "Imagine if this were your child in your situation. What would you do?" Yeah, I'm not coming back. I apologize for the stupid idea, the wasted time. I'd have a very different conversation with me if I were you." "And I'm sure you'd understand," too, Violet replied. Olivia nodded. "Thank you." She turned and walked toward the parking lot, waving to Nancy as she went. And I was still feeling sorry for myself. At first, Violet thought, looking at her, though I was never as lonely as she was. Leslie won't arrive from her business trip until tomorrow. Nancy is already asleep, and Olivia and Nanny have one eye in the other. No, there's nothing to be afraid of course. Max wouldn't be coming. He didn't like to make things difficult for himself and hardly liked it when they broke up. Was Violet not lying about herself already? She was in love with a man she should stay away from in the first place. How could she have been so naive? She asked then, telling her mom. She wasn't even asking her mom. It was a question in space. But Mom answered if we were smart in love, mankind would have died out long ago. Convincingly, she answered. So that doesn't speak to your personal stupidity. It's just the way things work. And I've had that. What do you think? See, I'm alive and enjoying life. I don't think I can ever really be happy about anything again, Violet was saying. I thought so too, answered Mother. The main thing is that you don't make yourself insincerely cheerful. If you want to wear mourning for love, wear it. It will end. You'll see. Maybe the psychologist would burn me at the stake, but I think so. Violet believed Mom. Mom was not only her own psychologist, but she was also a psychologist to others. Violet was sure that many clients went to her over the years, not so much for a closet makeover, as for a conversation to chat with Mom and see that their problems weren't so dire and insoluble. And then came a series of happy coincidences. Haley introduced Violet to her wonderful friend Leslie. Leslie's older sister Sylvia turned out to be the head of a prestigious private daycare center in Los Angeles and was just visiting. She enticed Violet to join her. Even after learning of her pregnancy, Violet initially doubted how she would be alone in Los Angeles with a baby. Sylvia reassured her. Not alone. Think of us as family. Your mom and my brother are about to get married. I live alone in a big apartment. It just so happens, and I can't stand being alone. I'd love it if you'd keep me company. If things don't work out, you can always go home. Violet was a little hesitant, not ready to leave her mom, her little group. I spent the night wondering how she would feel at Sylvia's, she said. Her mom snapped at her with her opinion. Don't think I'm kicking you out by deciding to start a new life. But I'd go if I were you. I'd try it for a reason. Fate throws in coincidences to make it easier for you to start over. And that's how Violet ended up in LA. Living, working, raising Nancy. And a year ago, she met Tyler at the supermarket. I accidentally put a chicken in his cart instead of hers. And that was the last one. We laughed at that reaction. Violet was already married to Tyler for 3 years when she found out she was expecting a baby. She went to the clinic to check in and ran into Deborah at the front door. She had put on a lot of weight, but it looked good on her. Oh, Violet. Deborah rejoiced. Look, you were right. You must be a good witch. She pointed to her prominent belly, and Deborah looked different. She glowed with a contented calm. I'm so glad you and Max are doing well, Violet said sincerely. I'm fine, but I have no idea about Max. We don't talk. I've only been with him for like 2 months since I met him. I tried like a stubborn donkey to get him to adopt a little girl from the orphanage. He even stopped calling me by my first name, just sister. Mole, I'm obsessed with wanting to have a baby. I'm limited, Deborah said, and I was really getting kind of crazy. I'm used to getting what I want. Of course, it was hard on me. Max had a young girl when I found out by chance. I didn't feel anything special. I just felt sorry for the girl. I met her, drew a verbal portrait of our mutual Max out of female solidarity. We're still friends, by the way. But she dumped Max. Not immediately, of course, but the main thing by herself. I gave up then, decided to get away. I went on vacation alone so I wouldn't have to see his perpetually disgruntled face. And there I had a resort romance, and I suddenly realized thanks to him my husband does not love me at all, and I do not love him anymore. I was wrong about him. I saw it clearly. What's there to stand out for? So I went home and got a divorce. He even quit his job out of fear, as if my father would go after him. He never would. My dad's not that kind of man. My resort fling turned out to be serious love. Who knew? And now I'm about to be a mom. I'm pretty sure I know the real reason Max and I didn't have kids. He didn't love me at all. And it worked like birth control for some reason. Everyone laughs at me, even my mom. One old doctor said, Yes, I've seen cases like that. You're not the first. And I believe you if you feel that way. That's the way it is. Bring your baby to our daycare center later. Violet smiled. I was just going to say that. I'll bring my baby to your daycare center. Olivia laughed. I'm going to have a son. You don't have to wait so long. Come visit us with your husband. And they exchanged phone numbers. Violet walked home happy. She remembered Deborah sometimes. And it was a sad memory. It was nice to know that another person's life had changed for the better. It seems like they're definitely going to be family friends. If that's how she feels, that's how it is.